The protagonist suddenly felt she was out of breath. Hands roughly grabbed her by her clothes and lifted her up, and then that man furiously struck the young woman in the face, telling her that she had ruined her family's destiny with her recklessness. The man was outraged that she had tried to drown herself on the eve of her wedding. The protagonist looked at him bewildered when he called her Haley, but she didn't know who Haley was because our heroine is named Kang Yijie. Her grandmother was already fed up with hearing about her granddaughter's oddities, so she asked her why she was doing it again if there was no one there. The little girl kept seeing things, and the adults were beginning to think she was possessed. In Chungnam, there is a spiritual shaman, so the woman proposed, sending the girl there as he would surely help. Many didn't understand how a god had saved her since the little girl Yijie was so skinny and useless. She was abandoned by her parents right after birth and saw things she should have never seen. Grandmother Johnson raised her, but the protagonist only lived by running errands. However, the girl was now seeing this place for the first time and didn't know the man hitting her at all with such fury. But Yijie understood she was inside Haley. The protagonist didn't feel the presence of this body's owner at all. Suddenly, all sounds ceased abruptly and the girl froze. Around her, Haley's memories began to flash by one after another, but for some reason, they were all in the water. Now the protagonist understood Haley had thrown herself into the water of her own free will. Eventually, Haley's soul must have become a ghost or disappeared. She hadn't reincarnated, but had instead occupied a dead body. Meanwhile, the man was shouting even louder because the insolent brat wasn't paying him the slightest bit of attention. Considering the memories Yijie saw, that man was Haley's father, Duke Duncan. He was furious because his useless daughter didn't understand the enormous effort he had invested in that engagement. A sudden voice and words about an unusual spectacle spoken with a smile stopped the Duke. With all his might, he threw his daughter away from him. Now the man knew exactly how discipline was enforced in the duchy. He ordered Duke Duncan to leave, as he needed to speak with his beloved fiancée. Her father remained motionless, so the young man approached and coldly ordered him to get out. That man appeared in Haley's memories. He is her fiancé, the ruler of this country. But the girl now, Haley, had never seen so many vengeful spirits, which made her body tremble uncontrollably. She didn't understand what that man had done to be haunted in such a way. The young man tilted his head slightly and asked why she was trembling so much. Obviously, Haley couldn't be calm seeing all those horrifying ghosts surrounding the man. Meanwhile, the young man sighed wearily and asked his fiancée to stop trembling in front of him, as he wasn't going to kill her. The heroine remembered that Haley had taken her own life on the eve of her wedding, and that it had caused a huge scandal. She replied to her fiancé that his words were making her tremble even more. Those words made the man laugh. He lifted the girl's chin and explained that he had only come to talk, since they had barely exchanged a few words before. However, he didn't understand. Didn't the girl desire this marriage so much that she decided to take her own life? She didn't know the answer because Haley's memories were still incomplete. The heroine doesn't want to die, so she answers hesitantly, "It's not that I hate you." She froze just as her fiancé asked if she still couldn't forget another man. In Kang Yijie's life, this hadn't been an issue, but in Haley's, it had. However, now her fiancé didn't care which man she held in her heart. He would gladly support her sincere love, but he doesn't want history to remember him as an unhappy king. His words brought a look of astonishment and bewilderment to the protagonist's face. Meanwhile, the hero insistently lifted Haley's chin and told her that in his opinion, she should continue to live, though if she was truly dying to die, she should put on the crown first. The protagonist understood. He was the kind of person who is unhappy wherever he goes. The girl can see ghosts. And in the past, she was taken in by Grandmother Johnson, a famous fortune teller. The grandmother, to prevent the spirits from causing harm, treated visitors with care and never minced her words. Whenever she could, she told her granddaughter to avoid water. The heroine had tried to ignore spirits her entire life until this moment when she woke up in Haley's body, and then she met a man who dragged a legion of spirits along with him. Now he was offering to make her queen. Although in her previous life, Yijie had only worked in a mountainous region, the spirits were watching her, which meant they were waiting for the girl's answer. One must not meet their gaze. Haley decided to venture just one question. "If I reject your proposal, what on earth will happen?" The ruler answered thoughtfully. "The reason for the postponement was that the bride became gravely ill. If Haley refuses now, it won't be a cold but a fatal illness. Because then you'll have to die." The girl's reaction seemed amusing to him. Now Haley had to answer whether she would throw herself into the water again or assess the situation sensibly. The protagonist shook her head. She was not going to give up her life. At least as her fiancé had said, not before she wore the crown. That wouldn't happen, and that was something Haley could promise. He reflected on her words, but decided to trust her, though his expression said the complete opposite. It wasn't surprising. Who would believe someone who nearly died over something foolish just yesterday? His Majesty, smiling, said that this time he would overlook his fiancé's mistake. He then immediately ordered for Duke Duncan to be summoned. A short while later, Haley's father returned to the room. He was furious at having to obey another's orders in his own mansion. The young man struck the floor with his scabbard and warned the Duke that there would only be one warning. His daughter would soon be the Queen of Cayenne, just as the Duke wanted. That means he can no longer lay a hand on her as he pleases. But if the Duke ever raises a hand to her again, he had better remember his king's face first. Haley was horrified by the malevolent aura enveloping her fiancé. The protagonist realized that he could truly kill the Duke. The dark-haired man cursed internally, feeling that familiar sensation, but he quickly controlled the emotions that were overwhelming him and asked the Duke for his response. The head of the Duncan family nodded against his will, accepting His Majesty's proposition. Haley couldn't believe it. If her fiancé were a normal person, he would have gone mad, but he managed to suppress the spirits with his own power. The girl froze when she saw the dark-haired man extend his hand. Only then did she remember that she was still kneeling, so she placed her hand in His Majesty's, accepting his help. But the hero did nothing else, and Haley had to stand up on her own, not understanding her fiancé's actions. Suddenly he took her hand and kissed it, asking if 4 days would be enough for her to recover from her cold. The scandal has already grown so large that waiting any longer is impossible. After receiving the young woman's consent, His Majesty announced that this was his final act of grace toward the Duncan family. He embraced her tightly and begged Haley Duncan to arrive alive at the place where he alone would be waiting. Now the hero had to return to the castle. From now on, some royal knights would protect Haley until the wedding ceremony to ensure nothing happened to her, and at the same time, they would make sure the Duke didn't raise a hand against the future queen. Roderick Perry Blake is the ruler of the Kingdom of Cayenne, carrying so much karma and resentment, yet he still managed to survive. So the protagonist couldn't help but wonder who he truly was. 4 days flew by, and the long-awaited wedding day finally arrived. Many already thought something would happen again because misfortune always befell the brides. They say that Duke Duncan is a truly terrifying person. These rumors were present in Haley's memories. The memories are incomplete and have many gaps, but it can be said for certain that the king had already tried to marry twice. He only had one condition. It had to be a weak, noble family with no aspirations for power. The first bride died in an accident, the second was poisoned, and the third one had barely succeeded. However, the protagonist knew that the third attempt had also failed, because the real Haley had drowned in the river. Roderick entered the room and asked the bride if she'd had sweet dreams, as it was her last night at home. But that house wasn't worth missing. Haley replied in confusion that she had slept well. Today, surprisingly, nothing was clinging to her fiancé, but the protagonist clearly remembered him being covered in evil spirits, so she didn't understand why. If you looked closely, Roderick had a rather handsome face. In a way, Haley even felt a little envious. The king noticed his fiancé's stare, and frowning slightly, he asked with annoyance what she was doing. The protagonist realized she had been staring at him intently, so she quickly looked away and apologized to her fiancé, saying she was very nervous. Roderick sighed wearily and said coldly that he hates being lied to. The king knew for certain that the lady was not nervous at all. The protagonist covered her mouth with her hand, realizing she had made a mistake again, and Roderick found her reaction amusing. The girl decided to be honest, and admitted that she was just trying to be more cautious in front of a high-ranking person. If she didn't control herself, she might make a mistake. Haley began to get nervous about being too honest, but the king asked her to continue acting just as she was. He understood what she meant. A servant entered the room with a knock and a bow, announcing that it was time to leave. Roderick turned to the lady and told her it was time to go, taking His Majesty's hand. Haley proceeded with the king to the ceremonial hall. The body's ingrained habits were terrifying. The protagonist never wore high heels or such voluminous clothing, but she could walk so naturally. Suddenly, the girl felt a slight breeze. Horror gripped Haley's entire body as the terrible suspicion struck her. Sensing another aura, the heroine looked up. Right above the priest's head was a spirit on a noble white horse. Its face remained serious, expressing no emotion. It was the first time Haley had sensed such a magnificent spirit, which is why she was now in a state of emotional turmoil. It didn't resemble a ghost or an evil spirit. However, despite that, it was on a higher level. Suddenly, the creature's gaze turned towards Haley. The girl instantly lowered her eyes, aware that if she got involved with it, trouble was guaranteed. Suddenly, Roderick asked Haley Duncan in bewilderment what those antics were all about. The protagonist apologized and gripped her fiancé's arm tighter. This world is a strange and terrifying place, and it is most likely plagued with vengeful spirits. Therefore, Haley must act cautiously. In the middle of the night, the commander of the first squadron advised His Majesty to consider their offer. However, Roderick replied mockingly that even if it were the Duncans, it wouldn't be easy. Now Jade, the commander of the first squadron, is saying outrageous things. Contrary to what Roderick had already heard, she doesn't seem so naive. Jade decided to find out if the incidents in which 2 fiancés died were really the work of that person. His Majesty's fiancés are very suspicious, which is why the commander of the first squadron suspected that Haley Duncan's father eliminated all the rivals. Roderick's gaze turned cold and thoughtful when Jade asked if the king believed Duke Duncan was guilty. If the previous 2 fiancés hadn't been murdered, there would be no need to form a marriage alliance with a family as powerful as the Duncans. The Duke openly declared his desire to marry into the royal family, and it is very likely he is the culprit. However, Duncan's daughter tried to commit suicide. She wasn't the target of an assassination attempt. She had no intention of becoming queen. although this fact does not eliminate the suspicions about her father. So for now, the Duncans must be watched, and they must think about how to use Haley to their advantage. Confused, Jade asked His Majesty if it wasn't time for him to leave. It seems the captain of the first squadron feared the king would abandon his bride on their wedding night, but the king ordered more to be served. Jade asked His Majesty to show more compassion as his wife was still just a young woman caught on the board. Instead of answering, Roderick ordered someone to stay in the queen's chambers to watch her. Jade accepted the order and asked His Majesty not to worry about it. Roderick downed all the alcohol in one gulp and slammed the glass down on the table. Immediately after, the man stood up and headed for the exit. Today the king seems to be well. The commander of the first squadron supposed that His Majesty's madness had probably subsided. The king suffers from nervous breakdowns and severe insomnia, and as the symptoms worsened, the rumors spread. Jade silently prayed for his ruler to be well. Roderick walked with a steady pace toward the room he needed, but the dark spirits managed to reach him. The king again heard the creature's demented laughter, which didn't cease for a moment. He was even surprised at how well he had been feeling, but now he felt as if his head was about to explode. The protagonist looked at her reflection in the mirror and wondered if her nightgown was too thin. Today was their first wedding night. Nothing like this had ever happened to Kang Yeye because she always hid in her village. It's not that she's against it. It could even be considered a great opportunity, because the ghosts of virgins and bachelors were especially resentful. The protagonist didn't understand why it was so important in their lives. Therefore, Haley decided she would definitely try to find out. However, all her enthusiasm vanished the moment she saw her husband in the doorway. With his arms crossed, Roderick clutched his head, which wouldn't stop ringing. Haley didn't understand why there were so many evil spirits around him, as if the man had been on a battlefield or in a cemetery. Suddenly, the king announced, "You are the queen now." The duke is very particular when it comes to his son. Roderick sat on the edge of the bed, and the protagonist began to think feverishly about what to do. She also sat down feeling uncomfortable. Haley decided to break the silence and asked the king if he was all right. They couldn't allow the man to succumb to the voices of the evil spirits that kept screaming in his ear, so the heroine began to shake her husband by the shoulders, begging him to come to his senses. Roderick raised his head and looked at the girl in bewilderment. He had completely lost his mind. That's why Haley began to shake the man even harder, screaming at the top of her lungs that he wasn't like this at all. Roderick grimaced as if in pain, which meant the protagonist's words were indeed reaching him. However, the man lost consciousness and collapsed onto Haley, but the girl could see that he was much better. That man's physique is very good. His sharp nose, his chin, and the shape of his head are just perfect. But be warned, even though Roderick is weak, his energy is astounding. Evil spirits shouldn't cling to someone like him. Why is this happening to her? Haley wondered as her grandmother's words echoed in her mind. If she starts to notice the spirits, they will also notice her. If she meddles in the affairs of the other world, that world will meddle in her life. So it's better not to even try, right? But he saved her from Duke Duncan, who was mistreating her. Haley only sees spirits and has some abilities she learned from her grandmother. If she gets involved with spirits, she'll only end up losing. But as a way of thanking him, shouldn't she help him at least once? At least so that he can sleep soundly tonight. The evil spirits instantly understood that this girl could see them. The protagonist abruptly tore a piece of fabric from her nightgown, the amount needed for the ritual. She wasn't sure if it would work, but she still bit her thumb until it bled. After all, fighting ghosts is a battle of wills. That's why the girl drew symbols with her blood on the torn piece of fabric, and then ordered the dead to leave, because the world of the living and the dead must never mix. The impure forces must return to where they belong. After those words, the souls began to retreat. Panting, Haley concluded that she had succeeded, but she instantly felt nausea rising in her throat and a slight dizziness. Haley hadn't managed a complete purification. She only drove the dead away briefly, but they will return. The protagonist decided to hide the amulet under the bed, but at least now the king would be able to sleep peacefully tonight. Haley was able to repay his kindness. The young woman felt a sudden weakness, so she curled up next to the man and fell asleep. The next day dawned. The protagonist slowly opened her eyes and immediately saw someone in front of her. She flinched when the king, in a suspiciously calm tone, asked if she was awake. Haley instantly recoiled. The confused girl asked the man why he was looking at her so strangely. He pointed to her torn nightgown. Haley blushed instantly, and Roderick asked if it was his doing, as he didn't recall a passionate night. The girl immediately began to wave her hands, trying to explain that nothing had happened between them. Of course he wasn't complaining that nothing had happened between them. Roderick threw a blanket and told the protagonist to cover herself. If it wasn't him, the man asked if there was anyone else in the room. Haley didn't know how to explain herself and replied that she had done it herself. Roderick didn't understand the reason, and the girl explained that she was very hot and felt stifled while sleeping. The king pretended he hadn't heard any of it. Then he got up to leave and allowed the girl to rest a little longer. The door slammed shut, and Haley was even more embarrassed that the king pretended not to hear anything. So it wasn't him, Roderick thought to himself. The memories of last night were fragmented because the man thought he was on the verge of madness. However, now his mind was clear. Since Haley Duncan arrived at this castle, this had happened twice, but the girl kept making strange excuses. 4 days have passed since that moment. After that horrible first night, Haley didn't see the king again. It's not that she was going to thank him, but for some reason the girl was a little sad, but now is not the time to think about that. The protagonist decided to try to make a decent amulet, but she didn't have the necessary ingredients after that night. The evil spirits began to torment her, whispering incessantly that Roderick would cut off her head and she would die, inevitably and painfully. However, the girl had already died once, so it would be cruel for it to happen to her a second time. She needs to raise a barrier, which means hiding piles of amulets, behind the paintings and under the furniture. Now Haley was beginning to regret not having listened to her grandmother and helped the king. Suddenly, the protagonist heard a soft cry. It didn't sound like an evil spirit because the energy was completely different. Haley approached the curtain and pulled it back. She immediately froze and looked down in surprise. On the floor was a small shining spirit sitting with tears in its eyes. The bewildered girl asked the creature what it was doing there and why it didn't go home, but the little one replied that its home was there. Haley understood that it was not an evil spirit, so she promised she wouldn't hurt it. The little one confessed that it was actually very scared. The protagonist began to worry that she was the one scaring the little one with her amulet. But then Haley turned her gaze to the cracked jewelry box. It seems this object is more than 100 years old, and old objects often contain someone's memories. So it's the spirit of the jewelry box, perhaps because the jewelry box is damaged. It can't hide or use its powers completely. Haley apologized to the little one as her clumsiness prevented her from fixing it. But instead she promised that she would not allow dark forces to enter that room. It was all she could do so the little spirit wouldn't be afraid. The little one agreed and begged her to leave what she had in her hand in its house. It began to spin around, repeating its request over and over again like a small child. This cunning spirit must be not 100 but 300 years old. The protagonist fulfilled its wish, and now a smile radiantly lit up the little spirit's face. At this, Haley also began to smile. It seems that after arriving here, this is the first time she has been happy and smiled. Another 4 days passed. The protagonist fell ill from the energy she invested in the amulets. She overdid it. Still, there is much to be done to stabilize this place. There's no time to lose. Haley carved some wood and made a bracelet, but this is not enough. We need more. The young woman must carve a pillar and place it in the room to increase protection against the evil spirits. Roderick leaned over the girl and asked what she was doing. What could he want to know? Startled, the protagonist dropped the amulet. Oh no, what a disaster. The handmaiden told the king that his wife is not well, so Roderick brought medicine to see her. Then the man pointed to Deborah, who was standing behind him. What a surprise! The protagonist didn't expect it, so she awkwardly thanked him for his concern. How awkward! The girl looked at the door and saw that the spirits couldn't enter. The barrier's effect is working. But it couldn't stop the most horrible ones, so the pillar must be set up as soon as possible. Roderick decided to take a look at what his wife was fiddling with. It turned out to be a simple cylindrical stick of considerable size. The king and the handmaiden were suddenly petrified. Deborah suspected that nothing happened on the wedding night, but she didn't think it would come to this. Unexpectedly for Haley, the king confiscated her amulet, and also the knife she had in her hand. The queen, who just jumped into the water a short while ago, has a knife, so Roderick couldn't let it slide. Therefore, this thing is also confiscated. The protagonist couldn't believe it. I need to create the exorcism pillar. Roderick headed for the exit, asking the girl to drink the medicine he brought her. He went to review the report from the captain of the knights, because it seemed suspicious to him. Then the man discovered that from the queen's room came a burning smell and the soldiers found ashes. The girl managed to find a kitchen knife and is carving something every day. That was precisely what unsettled Roderick. Moreover, he didn't understand what the hell was going on. The protagonist collapsed exhausted onto her bed. She is terribly frustrated because she could have finished the pillar in a couple of days, and now it was all in vain. In the end, Haley has nothing to do now. That's why the protagonist took out the book she had hidden under her pillow a few days ago. Now we can finally read this. The Diary of Haley Duncan, which the protagonist brought from the duchy. October 17th is the real Haley's birthday. The little spirit asked her how she could see it, when many priests visited this room and no one saw it. Although there are good priests who can see, those must have been fakes. They just pretend to be benefactors to take your money, and if you're not careful, they'll rob you blind. Although the little one reminded her that it doesn't have a face. The protagonist picked up this diary on purpose, hoping to recover her lost memories. Haley lived without worrying too much about anything. Suddenly, the handmaiden Deborah knocked on the room's door. The protagonist set the diary aside and allowed the woman to enter her room. Deborah brought a letter from the queen's maternal home. There was also medicine, but the protagonist refused to take it, because she was no longer sick. But Haley did accept the letter. In it, the Duke expressed concern for his daughter's condition, and said that he was sending the medicine along with the letter on purpose. However, the girl knew it was all a lie. As a father, the Duke wanted to ask his daughter just one thing. This intrigued Haley. The protagonist urgently needs to see His Majesty, and she learned from Deborah that the king is in the reception hall. The handmaiden also reported that at that very moment, she would call the servants to dress the queen. Haley didn't understand how she should respond to the Duke. The owner of this body, who was supposed to be queen, felt almost nothing. When the soul leaves, the feelings do too, and only resentment or ideals prevent it. Then, they become vengeful or protective spirits tied to this world. The Duke knew that many served the king, but he wanted people from his estate. At that precise moment, they were debating inside the reception hall, heatedly about the looting of the royal treasury. Roderick was forced to listen to it all. The officials flinched upon hearing a loud bang. Looking at the king, Roderick asked coldly if they were finished. Perhaps there are still some in this room who haven't spoken. Jade knew that the king was very dangerous like this, and that if it got worse, he would have to be stopped. 3 years have passed since his ascension to the throne, and his dark side has intensified. It seems as if he has become a completely different person. 2 people witnessed the horror by accident at the worst possible moment. Deborah proposed to the queen that they return to her chambers, and Haley agreed. The protagonist decided not to get involved, but the evil spirits swirled above the king and laughed loudly, demanding he kill everyone in that room. This worried Haley greatly. Suddenly, the king gripped his sword tightly and began to draw it from its sheath. The protagonist shuddered at the sight and froze. The commander of the First Night Squadron shot up, wanting to prevent the king from making a fatal mistake. However, Haley was faster. The evil spirits continued to whisper their desires to the king. The protagonist ran to his majesty and grabbed his hand tightly, the hand that held the unsheathed sword. In reality, Haley had gotten there without realizing it. She began to blame Deborah, who should have held her back more firmly. Roderick's gaze cleared as soon as he heard the voice of Haley Duncan begging him to listen to her. The protagonist also realized it. The light had returned to the man's eyes. Only then did she understand that the beads had caused that effect. That's why the evil spirits retreated a little. The king directed an astonished gaze at the young woman, and he whispered her name softly. He didn't understand what had happened or why Haley Duncan was holding his hand. The man looked at the officials, who were now sitting in silence, afraid to make a sound. Roderick carefully withdrew his hand from Haley Duncan's grasp and then sheathed his sword. The protagonist shuddered when the king turned sharply again and looked directly at her. He asked only one question: why? Haley was bewildered, as it was because of his majesty that all this chaos began. Now he was looking at her with an expression that told her not to make him repeat it twice. Haley actually came to talk about a letter sent by Duke Duncan. Since he has a bad relationship with the Duke, this would provoke negative emotions in the king, and then the spirits would be unleashed. Therefore, Haley lied and said she just came to offer a cup of tea, but it seems she did it at the wrong time. So she immediately apologized for her rudeness. Roderick looked at the girl with suspicion, and she explained that she just wanted to thank him for the medicines he had sent all this time. The officials are very nervous. The main protagonist began to mentally beg Deborah for help. The maid understood everything quickly and explained to his majesty that the queen loved the exquisite shuruk tea. In the end, Roderick ordered tea to be brought for them, and Haley mentally called Deborah the best of all. The king announced that the meeting was over for today. Meanwhile, our heroes went to have tea. The protagonist took a small sip and immediately tasted an unpleasant flavor, but she tried to hide it. Meanwhile, the king watched her attentively. Haley felt an immediate discomfort. The young woman was surprised when his majesty suddenly asked her what she was thinking, but what interested him most was why she had done it, and why she kept drinking such bad tea. This man was able to figure Haley out quickly. The protagonist wiped the tea residue from her lips and replied to his majesty that he couldn't judge her tastes. She was saying the same thing again. Haley was once again convinced that the king was not a stern person, and that he didn't mind joking. The problem is that he has evil spirits attached to him. As soon as the man moves away from her, those horrible undead begin to harass him. This guy truly made Haley very nervous. In any case, it's unpleasant to see, so the protagonist approached the king and asked if he had been sleeping well lately. Roderick responded with a question. Was it so obvious that he wasn't sleeping well? It was very obvious. The protagonist gathered her courage and then sat next to his majesty. She gently touched his hand with hers and began to massage the king's palms. The knights standing behind were astonished by their queen's action, who did not fear his majesty's wrath. Surprise showed on Roderick's face. This was getting out of hand. Everyone in the palace knows that the couple's relationship is quite cold. Jade hoped that his majesty's mood wouldn't worsen. Instead, Roderick smiled and asked what she was doing, and she replied that this helps one fall asleep faster. Haley confessed that she too had suffered from insomnia once. The smile did not leave Roderick's face, because now this girl wasn't even trying to hide her lies. Now Haley was convinced. The evil spirits had tormented the king for so long that his energy was now tangled and blocked. A person with his energy is even more dangerous in that state, but Roderick still didn't understand what she was doing. Haley knew better than anyone how energy flows in the human body. Before her grandmother's exorcism, the heroine had to keep the man's energy under control. She asked the king if it hurt, and he replied with a resounding no. Now Haley began to massage the man's back. Roderick relaxed and thanked the girl for her concern. People with great energy would hesitate to mess with vengeful spirits. That's why Haley wondered how many misdeeds he must have committed to be harassed like this. The heroine pressed a point, and Roderick immediately felt something strange. Haley had almost found the flow. The man didn't understand what was happening to him. Then he felt a growing warmth inside him, and his eyes began to close slowly. And then his body relaxed, and Roderick rested his head on the protagonist's legs deep in a profound sleep. Now the energy flow has improved a little. It will be easier for His Majesty to withstand the attack of the evil spirits for a while. But the protagonist still mentally apologized to the man, as it was the only thing she could do. Suddenly, the commander of the first squadron asked, stunned, if he was really sleeping. Haley explained that when one is tired and receives a massage, the tension decreases and the king was probably very exhausted. Jade responded, confused, that His Majesty had not slept in several days. Besides, the king has been suffering from insomnia lately. Now the commander of the first night squadron is trying to explain the situation that occurred earlier. Haley replied that sometimes people become very sensitive. One shouldn't make a big deal of it. She simply had no other choice. The butler brought a blanket and carefully covered His Majesty. From Deborah's disapproving look, the man knew he should bring another blanket for Her Majesty, but Haley replied that it wasn't necessary, because they had already finished their tea and could leave now. After these words, Roderick clung even more tightly to the girl. Haley understood instantly that those people behind her were thinking something strange. Of course, something stirred inside the protagonist. This man, King Roderick, simply moves instinctively, seeking pure energy, whether from the amulets the protagonist has, or from her virtuous energy. Since he has been suffering from the dark and impure force for a long time, he is trying to find a peaceful place. In the end, Haley requested that a blanket be brought for her as well. Deborah snatched it from the butler instantly. Haley was also exhausted, and it's not the same as when she invests her energy in creating amulets. Being with this man is definitely tiring, but for some reason Haley felt a warmth. Roderick blinked, dazed upon waking and realizing the situation. However, he decided to clarify it with Jade. The commander of the first squadron reminded His Majesty that after having tea with the queen, she sat next to him. But then the king fell asleep immediately. Jade decided not to mention how the newlyweds gave each other massages before sleeping. He simply couldn't do it. Roderick turned his gaze to the sleeping girl. He decided that the queen should be made comfortable in a suitable place, and his bedroom was the best option. Jade was dumbfounded to hear that while the king explained it was so as not to wake the queen since her room was far away. The butler and the maid began to doubt that nothing had happened between the king and queen on their wedding night. However, Jade immediately exclaimed that they must carry out His Majesty's order quickly. Deborah replied that she would go at once to prepare the room. Roderick's physical condition suddenly improved. Again, he looked at Haley Duncan and wondered who the hell she was. After a while, the protagonist woke up and immediately assumed she had somehow arrived in hell. Maybe she just died in her sleep, or perhaps she was reincarnated again. But the pink hair and her pale hands say otherwise. The protagonist is still in Haley's body, so she hasn't died. From the atmosphere and the cloud of evil spirits, she deduces that this is the king's room. She wanted to get out of there as soon as possible. The maid Deborah entered upon hearing Her Majesty waking from a long sleep. The protagonist begged the woman to take her back to her room. In the end, Haley escaped from the haunted house and found out the king had sent her to his room. The girl found it funny and laughed, as it was obvious the king was trying to repay her in some way. And just now Haley realizes she forgot to talk about the letter. In her diary, the lady wrote that her father wants to marry her to the king, but she loves Lawrence with all her soul. However, all the entries are short and their context is strange. The protagonist wanted to know more about the real Haley. Taking her father's letter, the girl thought, how would Haley act in my place? Come to think of it, the king proposed they have dinner together today, and Haley was surprised by such a sudden proposal. The protagonist went to the window and realized she doesn't want to die. The girl didn't understand why the real stupid Haley jumped into the water. Obviously, a predestined fate cannot be avoided. Even if you dodge a small nuisance, the thread cannot be changed. Like the deceased Haley, whose fate was to die. People often say they like their destiny, but they say that because they can't foresee the fate that awaits them. The protagonist never loved the fate she had to live. If you think about it, this is the first meal between the king and Haley. However, Roderick didn't invite the girl to have a pleasant time a few days ago. The commander of the first night squadron reported on a letter that Duke Duncan sent to the queen. Jade brought a copy for the king to read carefully. The letter speaks of infiltrating the duke's people into the palace, and the sender is aware of the queen's illness. It is evident that Duke Duncan is trying to get his people into the palace. He knows Roderick will not allow it, so he is trying to provoke a petty power struggle by these means. The king must put a stop to this at its root immediately. That is precisely why they wanted to place an insignificant noblewoman in the queen's place. Roderick proposed taking advantage of this opportunity to uncover the real Haley Duncan. But now the king did not know how to start the conversation. Those thoughts tormented Roderick relentlessly. Jade understood perfectly that His Majesty was not feeling well today either. The steward announced the arrival of Her Majesty the Queen, and Roderick immediately raised his head. His gaze lit up instantly. He raised his head and looked toward where Her Majesty's footsteps came from. The man stood up at once, and felt that the air around him had suddenly been purified. This happened right at the moment Haley entered. He observed the young woman's thoughtful face. and felt that with every step she took, a cool breeze blew. It was as if another world was converging around her. Surprisingly, his headache had disappeared. The protagonist looked at His Majesty with bewilderment, upon seeing him sigh deeply with a smile on his face. He announced that this was actually very strange. Haley understood nothing, and the king, with a smile, mockingly indicated that she could come in and sit. The protagonist obeyed his will. Roderick once again looked attentively at the young woman. Mustering her courage, Haley informed His Majesty that she wanted to tell him something, and the king allowed it. The protagonist revealed that a few days ago she had received a letter from her father from the duchy. Jade, standing behind the king, did not expect the young woman to mention that topic. Roderick smiled, thinking that this girl had beaten him to it as he had completely forgotten his initial objective. She spoke about the contents of the letter, which she had brought just in case for His Majesty to see. The king leaned back in his chair and replied that he did not need it, asking Haley what she intended to do. She was surprised that this time the king gave her the right to choose. She remembered the moment he himself had allowed her to die, only after she had put on the crown, or else he himself would take her life. The king burst out laughing at the girl's words. At that very moment, Jade did not understand at all why His Majesty was yielding to his opponent's words. Haley frowned and asked with annoyance if the right to choose was fair this time. Roderick laughed again and replied that when she expressed herself so honestly, she looked very inappropriate. He wondered how long it had been since he had laughed like that. This girl was decidedly amusing, so Roderick let her continue. Seeing the situation, the protagonist could deduce that everything was all right. He didn't know what Haley would want to do, so she first decided to give her opinion. The girl wants neither the king's nor the duke's influence, nor to take the real Haley's life lightly. That is why the protagonist replied that she would write to her father, rejecting the proposal. Those words surprised His Majesty. Not much time has passed since Haley arrived at the palace, so from others' point of view, it would be unfair. Jade was glad that now they would not have to enter into that meaningless discussion with the Duncans. However, Roderick thought it was too soon to relax because at first glance it might seem like a satisfactory answer. But surprisingly, the queen explained her refusal with a reason, not blaming him for everything. Although Haley refused, it would be wrong to completely reject the Duke, as anything could happen in the future. If she adds the words, "for now," she leaves open the possibility of future negotiations. Roderick knew it. His wife was only pretending to be innocent, but had planned everything she needed. You could say that the blood of a true fox runs through her veins. The young woman named Haley Duncan is quite interesting, although she still unsettled Roderick a little. The steward served the food, and the young woman asked His Majesty if she could eat. Since the conversation was over, Roderick allowed the protagonist not to have to wait for him in the future. The more he got to know this girl, the more interesting she became to him. But with all this, things were starting to get a little dangerous. Even if only a little, Roderick was beginning to feel attracted to Duke Duncan's daughter. Perhaps it was precisely because his madness was intensifying. Taking a drink, the king remembered an important detail. This week he is going hunting, so he will be away from the castle. The protagonist was stunned by such news. According to the first of the 5 commandments of God, one cannot take a life, because that accumulates karma. Roderick, the ruling beast Perus Blake, had a nickname derived from his middle name, Rabid Beast. The nickname came from his madness. As aware of his uncontrollable impulses, Roderick tried to relieve them by hunting, but without realizing yet, he was plunging deeper and deeper into the abyss of madness. The more blood the man sees, the more he accumulates the torment of vengeful spirits. The protagonist looked at the king, who at that moment was asking the knights if they had checked the provisions. Haley wanted to tell His Majesty that taking a life was not good, but she knew she would be mocked. At that moment, Roderick turned his head and looked at the young woman, right after he decided to approach her. In an indifferent tone, the man asked if she wanted to tell him something before he left. Haley realized that outside the castle the evil spirits clung to him less, and asked what he meant. Roderick offered to have him capture someone for her, but the protagonist rejected such a proposal. Then the man suggested wishing him a safe journey, and Haley did so. But in reality, she only wished the king would not go anywhere. Suddenly, he pointed to one side and asked the protagonist if she was not going to act like them. Haley looked at the knight and the maid who was accompanying him. Suddenly, the man pulled her roughly toward him and kissed her. The protagonist instantly turned red, very red. Haley could not believe that the king actually expected her to do something like that with him. Seeing the girl's reaction, Roderick let out another loud laugh, a smile on his face. He told the young woman that he was only joking. At this declaration, Haley tensed up even more, until the king told her she was gaping. The protagonist puffed out her cheeks and turned away as the king said it had been fun. In a slightly offended tone, Haley asked His Majesty to return safe and sound, and especially without any injuries. Roderick smiled and replied that he would do so. That attitude was getting on the protagonist's nerves. Suddenly, the man moved abruptly closer to Haley Duncan and whispered in her ear to stay away from the water. He pulled back a little, and for a split second he lingered, looking into her eyes, while their lips were dangerously close. Then the man straightened up and asked if she understood. He probably just fears that she will jump into the water like Haley did. In other words, he did not want her to die, and the protagonist's ears turned red instantly, and also began to itch terribly. With a smile on his face, Roderick announced that he had to leave. and then he departed toward his knights. Watching him go, the protagonist was left wondering if everything would be all right. Sometime later, the commander of the first squadron begged His Majesty not to pursue the wild boar, as the forest at night was dangerous, but Roderick ignored the advice and took the beast's life anyway. His eyes were dark, and all sound had faded. The man knew very well that he should not act this way for the sake of the kingdom and his subjects. If she were by his side right now, everything would be different. But now the evil spirits were whispering to Roderick to kill as many animals as he could. Jade stopped his horse as soon as they managed to reach the king. The knights could not believe that someone in this world was capable of tearing apart an already dead animal like that. Now Roderick seemed to have transformed into someone else, as if no hope remained. As soon as he heard the rustling of leaves, horror appeared on Jade's face. Right in front of His Majesty, a huge bear was rearing up. The commander of the first squadron immediately ordered them to fire, asking the king to step aside, but Roderick was not listening at all. In an instant, total darkness filled the man's eyes. It was the dead of night, but the protagonist could not fall asleep for some reason. If that man keeps killing, his condition will worsen, and that greatly worried the protagonist. Although, on the other hand, Haley did not understand why she cared so much. Finally, the young woman decided to go out for a walk. The moon was shining brightly, and Haley soon went out into the garden of the enormous castle. Nearby, the young woman saw a lake, but she didn't plan to get any closer because of Grandma Johnson's words. Perhaps because she had been told her whole life not to approach the water. The protagonist began to watch from a distance. Haley decided to sit on the steps when suddenly a gust of wind struck her. The protagonist's eyes opened upon feeling a familiar energy nearby. That spirit she saw at the wedding was now by her side. For some reason, he got off his horse, and then the spirit simply sat down beside her. Not even the god that Grandma Johnson worshipped was like this, so Haley must not contact him under any circumstances. However, a smile immediately appeared on her face. The spirit asked if she could see him. The protagonist, acting nonchalantly mentally, asked the being not to speak to her. Haley thought the best solution was to simply leave. She was about to get up when the spirit whispered that she was not the real Haley Duncan. The protagonist almost reacted, but in the end, she managed to contain her emotions. The spirit told the young woman that Roderick was coming this way because he had been injured. Haley continued to ignore him, and the spirit added that it was surely a very serious wound, but His Majesty doesn't even have an heir, so it's unknown what will happen if the king suddenly dies. Haley jumped to her feet, frightened by the spirit's words. The man burst out laughing and concluded with a smile that she was listening to him after all. The indignant protagonist asked if he dared to joke about a person's life. They always did the same thing. Seriously, Haley didn't understand why they acted that way with normal people. The spirit smiling told her not to be angry. That Roderick had truly been hurt. Maybe it was just a vile lie, but Haley could do absolutely nothing. The spirit suggested she hurry. She could meet him if she ran now. And then the creature simply vanished. Haley had to go to the castle now, where that man, the commander of the first squadron of knights, told His Majesty that the castle was already in sight, and to hold on a little longer. Roderick only saw darkness and prayed in his mind for anyone at all to help him. The protagonist ran at full speed until she smelled blood, a sign that His Majesty had returned. The knights ordered the butler to wake the doctor immediately. Haley didn't understand how such a horde of evil spirits had attached themselves to the king. The knights ordered the king to be taken to the bedroom, not suspecting they shouldn't do so. The protagonist thought feverishly about what she should do. Doubts tormented her, but finally the girl made a decision. Suddenly, she threw open the door to her room, thus waking a small sleeping spirit. Immediately after, Haley ran to the table and took out several amulets. The little spirit asked, in surprise, what she was doing, seeing that the girl wanted to take something strange from under the bed. He began to plead with her not to do it. Haley headed for the exit, promising that as soon as she returned, she would fix everything. The little spirit began to cry because he had just woken up, and there were already so many problems. If the body and mind weaken, the evil spirits will become stronger and more insistent. Besides, His Majesty's life is in danger. Haley hoped this would be enough. Upon running to the king's room, the girl discovered he was still tearing apart a prey that was already dead, and he wouldn't let go of the bloody sword. The protagonist immediately pushed aside all the servants, demanding they let her pass. One of the knights strongly advised Her Majesty not to enter the king's chambers for the time being. Deborah ran to Haley and begged her to return to her bedchamber immediately. The protagonist remembered that she was the queen, and therefore could enter any corner of this castle. Behind the maid, the doctor appeared, who ordered everyone to move aside immediately. Haley entered the room with him. As soon as she crossed the threshold, the young woman froze, shocked by the oppressive atmosphere of the room. It was plagued with monsters that wouldn't stop laughing hysterically and demanding that Roderick kill someone immediately. Out of fear, Haley even covered her mouth. The commander of the first squadron of knights looked on astonished, at Her Majesty not understanding why she had come. He held out a handkerchief and offered it to the queen to cover her face because of the strong smell of blood in the room, but Haley refused because it wasn't the smell of blood, but the enormous amount of negative energy. Only now did the young woman notice the wound from the claws of a beast on the man's body. He's not seriously injured. His life is not in danger. In other words, that shameless spirit simply tricked her. The doctor was left, stunned, when Her Majesty collapsed to her knees. The protagonist began to reprimand herself for falling for the ghost's words again. She became alert upon hearing His Majesty muttering something very quietly, still conscious. Only then did Haley understand he was saying kill. The king was repeating exactly what the spirits were endlessly telling him. Roderick's eyes were open, but they stared into the void, without reacting to anyone in the room. The queen and the doctor tensed upon seeing His Majesty raise his sword. If a wound to the soul can be called an injury, this man receives mortal wounds daily, but he has no one to tell the cause to, and no one can heal him, for Roderick is alone. The protagonist grabbed the king's hand. The knight immediately tried to stop the queen. This is very dangerous. Roderick looked at the protagonist as soon as she worriedly asked how he was. He only opened his eyes but did not regain consciousness. The evil spirits were too strong and would not give in so easily. Therefore, Haley must start this battle. First, strictly follow the law, because evil cannot defeat what is right. The spirits instantly shouted that they would not leave her in peace if the girl kept interfering. Initially, Haley was not going to get involved in ghostly matters, but now the complete opposite was happening. There is no one else in this world who can help the man, only her. Therefore, the protagonist was not going to back down, so she demanded that the impure forces disappear immediately. She must succeed no matter what. Roderick was plunged into complete darkness. He saw absolutely nothing, nor did he hear anything. In the end, the hero, like a truly mad king, cannot escape this darkness. But suddenly, Roderick caught a glimpse of a light. He raised his head and looked toward the sky. Someone called him, and Roderick reached his hand toward the source of the sound, still wondering who it could be. The man did not understand to whom that beautiful voice belonged. Upon regaining consciousness, Roderick let out a dull groan. Haley anxiously asked the king if he was all right, and if he could hear her voice. Roderick looked at the girl in surprise as she asked him another question if he could see her. As soon as the evil spirits vanished, the king's sword fell to the ground with a clang. The protagonist, in a sweet tone, assured him that everything was all right now. The doctor immediately cleared his throat and said it was not a serious wound. So the king was fine. Haley used too much energy and instantly felt a horrible nausea rise in her throat. In a hoarse voice, Roderick asked the girl why she was there. But the protagonist didn't know the exact answer to that question either, and supposed that she had simply gotten scared at that moment. The king could have thanked her for coming, but Haley decided not to say anything about that now that the man had regained consciousness. The girl could go back to her room. However, Roderick abruptly grabbed her hand with a hint of sadness and hope. He begged Haley to stay, even if just for a little while longer. In an instant, the king became very tender, and since Her Majesty arrived, everything feels like a dream. The heroine's heart began to pound and she pulled her hand away, reminding the king that he shouldn't strain himself like that. Sadness showed on Roderick's face. The protagonist knew this would happen. She began to hit the king with her hands, demanding that he never go on something like the hunt again. Haley stopped short, just as the king asked her why her whole body was trembling. But Roderick smiled anyway, and asked why he shouldn't go. With tears in her eyes, Haley replied that she loves animals very much. Deborah and Jade came to the conclusion that Her Majesty has gone completely mad. Roderick raised his hand and congratulated everyone on a job well done. Then he asked everyone to leave except for the queen. The protagonist felt the shame too late. She cursed herself for her action and wondered why she was acting so strangely. Roderick watched the trembling girl intently. The protagonist looked at him in surprise when he told her that he had seen a light in the darkness. And then he held out his hand. Haley took it just like now. In other words, the king dreamed that the protagonist drove away the evil spirits. Roderick supposed that the girl had seen horrible things upon her arrival, but didn't want to talk much. In reality, there's nothing that can be done about it. It might sound irresponsible and useless, but Roderick confessed to Haley Duncan that he couldn't do anything. So this guy knows what's happening to him and how damn serious it is, and yet his eyes were still bright. Are those really the eyes of someone with so much bad karma? Accumulated Haley couldn't feign ignorance while this man was falling apart alone. The king asked if she was angry about the trouble, but she said she couldn't be. Roderick replied that she is a Duncan, and moreover the queen. If she wasn't angry, perhaps she could talk with him a little longer. For some reason, the girl's voice calmed him. It's because of the heroine's energy and things like rosaries and amulets. Not her voice, but Haley agreed to stay anyway, and began to tell His Majesty something. 2 days later, in the royal castle, the queen fell ill again, so the Duke, Duncan, demanded to send familiar servants to care for her. Again, this man with the same old tune. In reality, Haley was working intensely on restoring the bedroom's barrier and ended up exhausted. Meanwhile, Duke Duncan exclaimed that his daughter couldn't make such requests. Roderick recalled that Haley was not only a daughter, but now the Queen of Cayena, so she should be treated accordingly. The Duke apologized for his rudeness and explained that he simply got very upset by the news about his beloved daughter. The king burst out laughing at those words. He remembered perfectly how that father used to hit his beloved daughter in the face. However, if Roderick said anything there, the queen's authority could be compromised. Normally, the man wouldn't worry and would simply kill him, but now he felt a strange uneasiness. The Duke announced that in that case, he himself would see the queen and ask for her permission. Haley's father had an expression as if his daughter would submit to his will out of weakness. But Roderick didn't understand why people took her for that kind of person. He smirked. and asked if anyone was forbidding a meeting with the queen. Jade shuddered and looked at the king in bewilderment. Roderick allowed the Duke to see his daughter because he knew she wasn't as he thought. The captain of the first squad didn't understand how the king could allow the Duke to meet with the queen. Instead of answering, Roderick asked Jade if he was doing his job properly. At first, when the lady was being investigated, he had reported that Haley Duncan was called a beautiful fool. However, all of that turned out to be complete nonsense. Roderick approached the queen's room and asked about her condition. The little spirit tensed up instantly, because that King Roderick had brought horrible beings again. The man entered and asked the girl not to get up. He immediately felt that, surprisingly, he felt very light. The protagonist was proud of herself, because this time, she managed to create an incredible barrier. It wasn't long before Haley got better, and then fell ill again, as if in revenge for the king leaving home. Roderick told the queen that her father was still demanding they send people to the palace. Imagining the Duke's expression, Haley burst out laughing, a smile on her face. Roderick told her that if she kept laughing like that, she would turn into a little rascal. Haley instantly covered her mouth with her hand. The man carefully studied the girl's pale face. Unexpectedly, the king asked the protagonist if he should assign people from the Duncan family to her. Jade was extremely indignant at his king's behavior. Haley reminded His Majesty that he was once again giving her a choice. She became curious as to why he was doing it, and Roderick answered in a thoughtful tone that he didn't know the right answer. The man decided to himself that he simply wanted to test her reaction again. The illusion of having the ability to make decisions is a very pleasant thing, but the protagonist replied that she would write a letter of refusal one more time, this time with more precise wording. At that moment, Roderick didn't understand the girl's intentions at all. Suddenly, he was left speechless upon seeing a small wooden statue next to Haley's bed. Everyone present froze, and the king asked what she wanted that device for. Jade turned as red as a tomato, and Deborah whispered to the butler that on the sovereign's first night, nothing happened. With an innocent voice, Haley explained that it was just her hobby. She also showed the king her bracelet, and asked him to return the knife so she could finish her creation. Roderick said with disgust that everyone usually likes them big, but the protagonist replied in confusion that being big doesn't mean being strong. The man replied in a tense tone that that was also true, although his was quite large. Even though Roderick didn't know what it was, he ordered them to hide that thing. A blushing maid informed His Majesty that it was time for his medicine. Roderick once again came to the conclusion that this girl was very strange. Disgust and even slight anger were visible on her face as she drank that horrible medicine. The man's eyes slowly began to close. Haley directed an astonished gaze toward the man. It turns out His Majesty had fallen asleep. The butler asked, almost without thinking what to do about this severe insomnia, since not even sleeping pills helped the king. And now Roderick was relaxing just by having the queen nearby. Jade wondered if the circulating rumors were true that the Duncan family hid a mysterious power in their blood. Haley tugged on the king's leg, waking him up, and told him it wasn't right to sleep like that. Roderick's eyes flew wide open in surprise. He hadn't expected to fall asleep. One second the hero was rambling, and suddenly, just like that, he was asleep in front of everyone. For some reason, he feels like he's going to have an epic nap. The protagonist tensed up when His Majesty announced that he was going to get closer to her and leaned in. He put one foot on the bed and begged her to let him lie down beside her. Deborah instantly moved to shoo those men out of the room. The maid wished them a good time and left, leaving Haley alone with the king. She wanted to send him to his own room, but that place seemed more like a haunted house. Roderick swore he wouldn't do anything. He just wanted to sleep like a normal person. The protagonist tried to offer him her pillow, but the king refused. The girl's cheeks lit up like two lanterns. She lay back down and reminded the king in an annoyed tone that he himself had decided to support her sincere love. But now he was getting into her bed. Roderick laughed and called it cute, as he didn't think she would say something like that to her husband. She apologized and admitted that for some reason, she decided to take a risk. In reality, Haley was very tired, so she was sure she could fall asleep very quickly. Unexpectedly, the king decided to apologize for the first night. The protagonist was startled by the intense gaze the man was giving her. She wondered how long this had been happening, but what he had just said sounded a lot like an apology. Roderick came to the conclusion that the pajamas hadn't been torn on purpose that time, although he couldn't believe it. If he became aggressive again, the king asked the protagonist not to tolerate it, but to call for Jade or the others. Roderick was referring to the pajamas that Haley tore to use as an amulet. The protagonist repeated that he hadn't done it. At that moment, it seemed the king was still worried about it. Roderick let out a deep laugh and suggested they sleep, but Haley knew he didn't believe her. Although she couldn't reveal the truth, the experience of being controlled by evil spirits and harming others was traumatic. The girl still didn't understand why she kept getting involved when she had so many problems. Such a big, strong man still hadn't broken. Our heroes fell asleep, and the servants took care of everything in the castle. Upon waking, the protagonist felt that she couldn't breathe and was suffocating. She barely opened her eyes, trying to understand what the hell was going on. It turns out that this whole time, Haley had been sleeping trapped in His Majesty's arms. A silent scream of horror escaped the girl, and she vowed never to trust a man. To this guy, the protagonist is nothing more than a pillow and a sleeping pill. Haley instantly turned as red as a tomato. The girl tried to think of him as a sick and very lonely man, so as not to take it to heart. The protagonist even began to consider the idea of counting sheep. But the man moved closer, and something strange brushed against the girl's body, making her panic. Haley kept counting sheep, but in her mind they were already kissing each other. The heroine must now escape her destiny as a virgin ghost and enjoy the afterlife. Suddenly the king pulled her even closer to him. Haley didn't understand at all why he kept touching her. She tried to push his majesty away even just a little to stop feeling so uncomfortable, but the man was still sleeping. He unexpectedly raised his arm sharply, and his face drew near the girl's neck, which made her freeze. Because now she felt the king's warm and steady breath, her heart began to beat even faster. Suddenly Haley felt the king's lips on her neck. She tried to gasp for air but found it difficult to do so. In the end, the protagonist started pounding on the man's back with her fists, demanding that he get off of her immediately. Because of this, Roderick finally woke up. In a confused tone, he told the girl beneath him that this pose was very strange. Roderick moved away immediately, super fast. The protagonist could finally breathe while her heart was beating 1,000 miles an hour. The man couldn't believe he had acted that way again in this situation. Haley got scared as soon as the king suddenly lifted the blanket. He sighed in relief because the girl's clothes were not torn, so he hadn't done anything wrong. Roderick apologized instantly. He touched her shoulder and apologized again in a soft voice. The man asked if she had been very scared. The protagonist turned towards the king, and now he could see her offended and pouting face. He stood up immediately and asked the girl to rest, but he couldn't just leave like that, so he pleaded with Haley to answer his question. But the girl remained silent, and so the man asked if she had decided not to speak to him. It was a bit childish, but the problem wasn't really that Haley was scared, but that she was simply very surprised. It was so hot and her heart was pounding hard, plus a tingling sensation wherever the king touched her. And now that he was being so affectionate, the girl wanted to act like a child, because she had never had something like this. Roderick apologized again, and gently stroked the girl's head. The man left, and their protagonist's heart continued to beat wildly. She didn't understand what that feeling was, but she knew she wouldn't get back to sleep. The king couldn't stop tapping his foot on the floor. He was a bundle of nerves. It had been more than 10 days since His Majesty had visited the Queen's chambers. The butler Jimmy was dying of curiosity. What had happened? But the commander had no idea. Now Roderick was restraining himself from going there, because the Queen might feel uncomfortable. But the man thought he couldn't have crossed the line given the look on her face at that moment. They were still a couple, and Roderick began to wonder what would happen now, even though this marriage was not what the Queen had wanted, which darkened Roderick's mood even more. The butler Jimmy placed a jewelry box in front of the king, and explained it was an offering from the Diamond region. Roderick asked Jade if he had seen the Queen's bracelet, and he confirmed it. According to the king, that piece of jewelry is horrible, as if it were hopelessly out of fashion. An image of his wife appeared in the man's mind. She had told him she made the bracelet herself. A faint smile appeared on Roderick's face, and he again called Haley a strange girl. Jade concluded that the king simply acts grumpy towards the person who interests him. The captain of the first squadron came to the conclusion that something had happened between the Queen and the king. She embarked on a search for the royal genealogy. The librarian replied that only members of the royal family could see that, so he would bring other records. Haley reminded him that she was His Majesty's wife, and therefore also a member of the royal family. The man immediately explained that it was a copy of written documents, and that he had something better for Her Majesty. The librarian fell to his knees, thinking he had committed a mortal sin. In the end, the protagonist decided to take a look at that book, and promised she would handle it with care. As soon as Haley returned to her room, she immediately asked the spirit to read its contents to her, but the little one didn't want to do so and begged the girl to take the book so she could read it herself. He pointed to Haley's diary, and told her she hadn't even read that, asking how she could live there relying on Haley's incomplete memories. It was insufficient. The heroine decided to read her diary, but it wasn't so simple, because the real Haley described literally the most absurd details of her life. In the end, the little one agreed to read the book. The first King Arthur conquered the Diamond Empire with a sacred sword, an empire that ruled the continent with an evil spell, and created a kingdom. And the fourth king, to celebrate 100 years of national unity, strengthened relations with Mellon Russell and Duncan. Now the protagonist discovered that the Duncans were originally another nation. Haley had been recording every word this whole time. She was stunned when the spirit only read about King Roderick, his birth, and his ascension to the throne, but at least the girl found out that her husband is 29 years old, a 4-year difference from her previous age, and 8 years with the real Haley, which is a lot. That's probably why the king sometimes treats her like a child. And the protagonist also discovered that the misfortunes of the Kingdom of Cayenne and King Roderick coincide this year as well. During this period, Queen Haley dies, and the soul of a person from another world unexpectedly settles here. The spirit noticed that King Roderick hadn't been coming around lately. He was happy because those horrible things don't follow him. In reality, the protagonist was doing her best not to think about it. That day, she had made him quite uncomfortable, so he surely doesn't want to see her at all. Actually, the protagonist no longer cares if people turn their backs on her. As soon as the queen stepped into the hallway, Deborah approached her saying she could have ordered someone to return the book. Haley replied that it was no trouble. and immediately heard a familiar voice. In the training arena, King Roderick was sparring, alongside the captain of the First Knight Squadron. The girl hadn't seen him in such a long time. The protagonist's heart, for some strange reason, began to pound again. The handmaiden explained that His Majesty and Sir Jade had the same master and used to train together, but it had been a long time since Deborah had witnessed such a thing. Now Roderick looked like an elegant beast. The protagonist felt that with every breath His Majesty's energy was being purified. Surely interacting with close friends was calming him down little by little. The girl mentally advised him to do this more often instead of hunting. Haley looked sadly at the king and suggested to Deborah that they should move on since he clearly didn't want to see her. He stopped and wiped off the beads of sweat that had appeared. Then he turned sharply in a fraction of a second. The man caught up to the protagonist and grabbed her arm. It was astonishing because just a second ago His Majesty had been so far away. Panting, Roderick asked Haley Duncan why she was simply leaving. The protagonist replied confused, that she was just on her way to her room. Annoyed, Roderick asked why she was speaking like that again, and asked her to speak like she used to. All this time she had thought he was avoiding her. That's why she wanted to keep her distance. The king's face darkened when Haley told him he could get back to what he was doing, that she was leaving. Roderick ran a hand through his hair, saying she was a true Duncan for making people nervous, but then the man replied that he wasn't talking to her. Suddenly the king took out a bracelet and offered it to Haley. The bewildered protagonist accepted the jewelry and asked in surprise if he was giving it to her. Roderick replied distastefully that the bracelet she was wearing didn't suit her very well. Jade interrupted the conversation, saying that the king was being rude as usual. He normally doesn't even look at jewelry, but as soon as he saw the bracelet, he mentioned Her Majesty and kept it. Roderick instantly turned red and ordered Jade to shut up. At the thought that a man like him had a side, so adorable, the protagonist burst out laughing. The king couldn't take his eyes off the young woman's smile. His sword fell to the ground with a clatter, and he suggested to the queen that they go together. The protagonist was a bit taken aback, but His Majesty explained they were going wherever she was headed. Jade shouted at His Majesty that he had been dragged all the way there. Haley laughed out loud again as she loved watching the king and Jade. Roderick's gaze involuntarily shifted to the queen and his cheeks turned slightly red. They say a fight between spouses is like cutting water with a knife. As our heroes walked down the hallway, the king asked the young woman if she was all right, and she nodded with a frown. The king asked if she wasn't supposed to answer with a question, and Haley repeated his question back to him. Roderick replied that he was afraid to approach her for fear of making her uncomfortable. How considerate. The surprised protagonist asked why seriously. The king replied that he was hurt that day too, because she looked at him as if he were trash. How painful. Haley let out a little laugh and explained that she was just surprised at that moment to see that His Majesty didn't hate her after all. Upon looking at the queen, the man understood he had been avoiding her for no reason. What a mistake. He contemplated the bracelet he gave her, and he pleaded to know if she perhaps didn't like it. An existential doubt. The protagonist replied with a smile that she liked it. Everything, and she thanked him for such a wonderful gift. However, her hobby is making bracelets herself. What a coincidence. This requires a lot of dedication and effort. How admirable. Roderick took her by the hand and answered thoughtfully that her tastes were very strange and unusual for a girl. Haley asked him not to judge her preferences, and this clearly annoyed the king. Behind His Highness, an evil spirit appeared. However, the girl was able to handle it without any problems. After all, it's the best ornament. The king didn't understand why, but he felt his shoulders lighten. Roderick decided to ask if she could read the copy of the royal genealogy that she had recently borrowed. It is written in a language Haley could not have studied, so the people of the Duncan family have no right to read it. But the girl replied that she was simply curious and was examining it. That means the king is informed of her every step. Most likely it was because she is the daughter of a political opponent. But in reality, the librarian feared that his words about the royal family might have offended His Majesty Roderick. He supposed she was not yet accustomed to palace life. Precisely for that reason, the man told her that in that castle, there existed a place called the Forest of Arthur. They had just been talking about genealogy, so Haley didn't understand why they were suddenly talking about it. She had the feeling she had heard of it vaguely, but perhaps those were just Haley's memories. Roderick told her it was a sacred forest passed down from generation to generation since the founding of the country. Neither nobles nor servants can enter the Forest of Arthur, except for the members of the royal family themselves. Therefore, the man suggested to the young woman that they go together immediately. The protagonist was surprised by such a proposition. However, she accepted immediately and placed her hand in the man's outstretched palm, but Haley did not expect to see something like this. It was the first time she had seen a place so full of sacred energy, and she almost fell to her knees ready to pray. However, most likely Roderick did not see that glow or feel anything. Until now, the protagonist thought that His Majesty would be better off far from the haunted castle. She thought the king would instinctively want to leave this place, but Haley was completely mistaken. This castle houses the Forest of Arthur, the strongest shield protecting the King of Cayenne from the filth. So logically, the question arises, at what point did it all go wrong? Sooner or later, the protagonist will discover the answer. The evil spirits were trying by all means to sneak in and reach His Majesty to induce him to do the irreparable. But the forest shield would not let them through. Now the most horrible evil spirits cannot enter this forest. For the first time since the wedding, the protagonist saw such pure energy in His Majesty. Roderick suggested to the young woman that they stop and take a breather. He spread a cloth over the stone so the queen wouldn't get so cold or dirty. Haley was a bit surprised by such thoughtfulness, and Roderick asked her not to come to this place without him. The girl decided to ask if he came here often, and if he didn't feel something like a good atmosphere. Just as she thought, Roderick considered this place to be something good. From then on, Haley begged him to come here more often and advised him to train more frequently as he did recently with Jade. Only then will the king be able to emerge victorious from this difficult battle. But now the girl was speaking like someone who was about to disappear, and Roderick asked what she was plotting. Haley answered sincerely that she will no longer try to die, since people die when it's their time. That's why she asked His Majesty to give her back the knife. The protagonist swore she would only use it for carving. After all, just one bracelet isn't enough, so the more things made the better. After taking a deep breath, Roderick promised to give it back, but the girl's words still sounded strange to the king. So he insisted and asked if she wasn't trying to die. In other words, isn't that the same as not even trying to live? Because people die when their time comes. He hit the nail on the head. In reality, Haley has a great desire to live. She also tried very hard, but no matter how much people struggle, destiny cannot be avoided. A light breeze blew, and the king concluded that something strange was happening. This girl is undoubtedly a Duncan, but at times it seems to Roderick that she lives in another world. Every morning one must meditate to cleanse their energy. Therefore, the protagonist has made this a habit. So today, the first thing Haley decided to do was start the day with meditation. The little spirit asked the girl if she would read a book today as well. Haley nodded to confirm its words. She took out a book on the history of the Kingdom of Cayenne, about the founding king and wielder of the sacred sword, the young Arthur. Nothing is known of his childhood. The young man rose up with the sacred sword and defeated the empire with divine power. As they fell, the Diamond families were scattered. The Mellon, Russell, and Duncan families were later integrated into the new Kingdom of Cayenne. To King Roderick, it was reported that the Damon Empire restoration movement has been completely crushed. They only tell him that, but the rebel forces have continued their resistance for days. One cannot be complacent. It must be extinguished at the root, come what may. The king held his head, and many began to think it was another fit of madness. A member of the council raised his hand and asked if the current number of border troops was insufficient. Duke Duncan requested that his eldest son Albert be reinstated as commander of the Western Border Patrol. He was demoted 3 years ago for no reason at all. Currently, the Kingdom of Cayenne is prioritizing a southern expansion policy, and that is not a demotion. The late king granted Arthur Duncan an honorable position, even if it was a cheap ornament for the duke's son. The tension between the king and Duke Duncan, leader of the anti-royalist faction, continued to mount. Albert slammed his palm on the table and exclaimed that the statement was an insult from the crown, but Roderick simply told the duke to worry about his own life. He had no intention of forgiving him just because he was the queen's father. Immediately afterward, the king left the meeting room. Duke Duncan, for his part, began to tremble with fury. The protagonist was surprised to be notified of His Majesty's arrival and stopped carving her artifact. Roderick entered the room reluctantly, saying that her father was clearly losing his mind. Lately, whenever something happens, the king comes to see the queen. Haley couldn't hold back her laughter. She was curious to know what her father had done this time to provoke such a reaction from His Majesty. Roderick sat down next to the queen and told her that the duke had asked for her brother to be reinstated. What a wonderful family he got with his wife. But the protagonist remembered none of this, so she decided to look it up in Haley's diary later. Her heart grew heavy just thinking about the diary. Suddenly, His Majesty asked the girl if his words bothered her. Jade mentally and indignantly asked if insulting her parents and siblings wasn't a signal to start a fight. But surprisingly, the girl replied that she didn't mind. The king knows perfectly well that things in the Duncan family are not so perfect. Roderick recalled how ruthless the duke had been with his only daughter that day. That's why Haley's words now made sense. This girl was ridiculed as a beautiful fool, which is why Jade didn't understand why the king was questioning that reputation. But in recent days, our hero was beginning to understand. The queen is no fool, as she calmly accepts everything she hears from His Majesty. Roderick, annoyed, said to Haley that she should look at the person who was speaking to her, but the girl explained that if she got hurt, he would take the knife away from her again. Roderick laughed and promised he wouldn't take it away because he wasn't that cruel. The protagonist asked him to remember those words, because it is very important to her. His Majesty asked for an explanation to properly understand what exactly it was. It isn't as strange a thing as everyone else first thought. However, it cannot even be considered an aesthetic ornament. Now the protagonist is carving an object very similar to the one His Majesty holds in his hands. In reality, carving helps Haley control her mind. But the king pointed out that this hobby was not appropriate for her age. The protagonist turned her head and replied to the man that he didn't look his age either in the opinion of Haley, and even the narrator of this story. He looks very young, and doesn't appear to be 8 years older than his wife. The girl didn't know that Roderick secretly felt sorry for her. At the man's reaction, the protagonist burst out laughing. Roderick threw gently from the girl's cheek, and with a childish reproach asked how she dared to laugh at the king. The protagonist held out the carved amulet to the king, telling him it now belonged to him. Roderick answered honestly that he wanted to politely decline it, but Haley decided to make that gift, putting her whole heart into it. However, if the man didn't want it at all, she could take the gift back, but Roderick immediately demanded the gift back, saying he was just joking. The protagonist asked him to put that thing under the bed. Although this talisman looks strange, it protects quite well against bad luck and nightmares. Haley made it especially so the king could sleep well. With the heroine's talent, she couldn't make an incredible amulet, but right now King Roderick needs at least a little help. The girl promised that surely there will be times when the sincere prayers of others protect His Majesty. Roderick instantly turned red, but Haley knew it would be difficult to achieve. This fact complicates people's lives. Before this even distressed the protagonist. The king swept his hair back and asked the girl to stop already. She couldn't help but say it. The hero would accept the gift without hesitation. The protagonist asked them to wait a moment. Soon, Haley brought another amulet and begged him to take it as well. Since it was a hobby, the protagonist could make many more. One amulet would be lonely by itself, so the protagonist with a big smile begged him to take both of them. Indecent thoughts instantly assaulted Roderick's mind. He snatched the gifts from Haley and announced his departure, asking her not to follow him, and then the door slammed shut with a bang. The protagonist found a new object to create another amulet, leaving Jade stunned. That girl was truly peculiar. The king slept that night, with Her Majesty's gifts on the nightstand. In the end, he managed to fall asleep for a bit, although it was a sad dream. Roderick wondered if the queen's gifts would really have any effect. However, something like that is impossible. But even without that, Haley was still a very strange girl. This morning, to the king's surprise, was not bad at all. At last, Roderick left the room and moved away from the amulets, because at night their aura disturbed the evil spirits. With the arrival of morning, the protagonist began to meditate again. The little spirit asked how much longer they would keep doing that, and Haley replied that she was confused today. This was all because of Haley's diary, which she had read at dawn. Normally it was so stupid it gave her a headache, but today was different. In one of the entries, the real Haley intended to talk to Lawrence to leave everything behind and run away from Cayenne with him. In the diary, the heroine came to the conclusion that she really was the fool, just as everyone said. The protagonist's heart begins to ache every time she thinks of Haley's beloved. Most likely, Haley loved Lawrence very much, even after Haley's soul died. Her heart remained in the body like ruins reduced to ashes by fire. The protagonist was left wondering how Lawrence was doing. Suddenly, the girl heard a noise coming from the hallway. She asked the spirit if he could hear what they were talking about, and he answered affirmatively. The little one told her that Roderick was going crazy again, but more intensely today. It hadn't happened lately, and Haley had even thought that the talismans she gave him had had no effect, just as she suspected. She wouldn't be able to deal with this problem on her own. The heroine has seen shamans ruin their lives several times by trying to do out of pity what is beyond their power. It would be wiser, at least for now, to close her eyes and not get involved. Suddenly, in the protagonist's head, the images of the king and Lawrence mingled. The real Haley didn't want to forget Lawrence, and the protagonist didn't want to turn her back on him either. The knights were doing the impossible to restrain the enraged king, but the evil spirits kept whispering that he belonged to them and that he should kill someone. Finally, His Majesty calmed down a bit. The queen ran to the commander of the first squad and anxiously asked about the king's condition. There's no point in stopping His Majesty. So Jade replied that he wasn't so out of his mind now, but it was better for the queen not to approach him at the moment. However, Haley knew it would be all right, as Roderick was only trying to overcome a strong impulse of madness. She shouted to the king that she had come to offer him tea today. This time the tea will surely be more delicious. The king's condition is serious, and if we use the bracelet as always, it will break. But there is no choice. Jade planned to take control if the situation became dangerous. He didn't understand why the queen acted in such dangerous moments without fear of her husband. Haley's body was trembling. She was still terrified of the evil spirits, but only the human heart flinches. She would be able to move forward if she stayed true to her intentions. He who follows the natural way will prosper, and he who goes against the will shall perish sooner or later. At last, the king's gaze began to clear, but strength began to rapidly leave His Majesty's body. Now the knights could safely let him go. The protagonist supported her husband so he wouldn't collapse right there. Haley was surprised when Roderick managed to even murmur something. He repeated that today he had finally managed to sleep well. The ugly little pieces of wood that Haley gave him definitely had an effect. Roderick, in a pleading voice, begged the queen not to look at him with such pity. And then the king's strength completely left him, and he collapsed, dragging the protagonist down with his weight. The knights helped carry the king to the reception hall. The butler was in shock, because this time His Majesty fell asleep the instant the queen arrived. Roderick slowly opened his eyes. At that moment, Haley was gently massaging the man's hand. Unexpectedly, the king asked the girl not to come near him in that state because he could not guarantee her safety. Imagine the danger. But those words were too weak for someone who truly wanted to give a warning. The protagonist wouldn't give those figures to just anyone, and she knew he had his reasons. Haley reminded him that she was a Duncan, and that she knew how to survive better than anyone. She asked him to treat her like any other Duncan without privileges. The girl wanted to keep his temperature under control so the situation wouldn't worsen. Although he had already asked before, the king insisted again, asking if she was responsible. The protagonist replied that it was good to relax after hard training, because he seemed exhausted. She always did it this way, lying a little, hiding a little, maintaining an ambiguous distance. For some reason, it began to seem to the butler that Her Majesty was putting much more pressure on the king now. Haley asked Jade since when the king had been in this state, and the commander replied that he had been feeling unwell since morning, but the protagonist wasn't interested in that at all. She was curious to know since when he had had such a bad temper. Jade replied that it happened after Roderick came to power, because after that he started to complain of headaches, but recently it has intensified. The protagonist didn't understand how His Majesty could endure all this for 3 years. It must be terribly hard. The king fell asleep again, and judging by how he clung to the amulet's energy, he was already at his limit. The protagonist asked Jade to spar more often with His Majesty like last time, but the captain replied doubtfully that the king becomes enraged very often when he picks up a weapon. Even if Jade's words were true, Haley couldn't be sure that banning weapons was a good idea. She became convinced of this after hugging the king several times, because he has an innate leader's instinct. Roderick possesses the energy of a sacred emperor, which could be called fatal if he didn't try to control every attack. The protagonist wouldn't be able to contain him, of that I am sure. To Jade's surprise, the queen asked for her husband to be taken to the Arthur Forest more often to get some fresh air. The commander recalled that the entrance to that place is forbidden to everyone except royalty because the original heroine's memories are mixed with Haley's, so the girl's mind is a mess. She completely forgot about that. In the end, the protagonist returned to her room and slept all day. Yesterday, she collapsed directly onto the bed. Today, she didn't even feel like meditating a little. The bracelet was still intact, though a bit damaged by recent events. Haley was sure that His Majesty would avoid her for a while, so she could take the day easy. Despite what the girl thought, the exact opposite happened. As soon as the king entered the room, Haley assumed that her father was talking nonsense again. Roderick asked with disgust if he needed a reason to visit his wife's room. He then added that he had simply come like a patient visiting the hospital. Smiling, the protagonist regularly reminded him that he used to not even want gifts from his beloved wife. Haley, as a member of the Duncan family, never missed an opportunity to be scathing, so when Roderick arrived, he suggested to the queen they have the tea they couldn't yesterday. While the girl drank her tea, the king wore a very thoughtful expression. Unexpectedly for Haley, he asked her to come closer and do the same thing as in the study. The protagonist tried her best using her limited skills, and Roderick saw it as a cat-like kneading. He told the queen that today he also hadn't been able to fall asleep. Her prayers didn't reach Roderick yesterday because she was surely thinking of someone else. But Haley still didn't understand why he was asking, although it always seemed absurd to her. Roderick noticed that the girl was cautious, but he didn't understand the reason. Surely she was hiding something, but it didn't seem like Haley wanted to harm him or the royal family. A smile appeared on his lips, and Roderick asked her why she was pretending not to understand. The man was too insistent, so the protagonist chose to feign compliance and sat down beside him. Immediately after, she took his hand and began to massage it. As Roderick suspected, for someone who trained so much, she didn't have many muscles, and her fingertips were soft. Her skin was delicate, with healed calluses from carving, contradicting what the queen said about her hobby. Roderick highly doubted she did anything like that before coming to the palace. Therefore, the man didn't understand why she was lying. The king wanted to talk about it, but upon looking at the girl, his expression changed instantly. Haley was surprised when His Majesty asked if she was trying to seduce him. He turned and told the protagonist that the front of her dress had come undone. The protagonist blushed instantly, not understanding how this could have happened. She flinched when the king asked her to remove her hands. Roderick skillfully resolved that little problem. Seeing His Majesty's face, the king noticed she was already red with embarrassment. Something like that is impossible to hide from prying eyes. The protagonist exclaimed that it was very improper, and he should have pretended not to see anything, but Roderick didn't want others to stare too. The king proposed that she consider it his slip-up. Haley made that face again, and the king apologized immediately. Perhaps she didn't like it, but he begged her not to hate him so much because now he feels much better than before. The protagonist, blushing, admitted that she also feels much better than at the beginning. This girl clearly knew how to manipulate feelings. Haley promised herself not to do anything conspicuous again, but she tends to make the same mistake twice. The next day, Kate arrived at the king's study. Roderick calmly asked if something was wrong, and the man told him about the report that had been made. The commander of the first squadron noted that His Majesty's health was beginning to slowly improve. The cause of death of the first woman who became His Majesty's bride is poisoning. Until the second bride was poisoned, Roderick didn't know that Duke Duncan would be so obsessed with marrying into the crown. Jade revealed to the ruler that Haley has a diary she brought with her from the duchy. There are about 10 chapters, and after arriving at the palace, she doesn't write anything. She just opens it sometimes to read. The commander asked if he should investigate the contents. For some reason, Roderick doesn't want to do it, so he decided to allow the queen at least that. The king does not want to be the typical man who reads his wife's youthful diary. So Roderick suggested ending the chat about the Duncans and going to stretch their bodies. The spirit asked the girl why she was pretending not to see him or want to talk to him. He appeared just when Haley had finally decided to rest. The protagonist begged the spirit to stop talking to her because she just wants to live like a normal person. But for someone who says that it seems Haley brought trouble upon herself, this ghost really hits the nail on the head. Once again, the king knocked down the sword of the commander of the 1st Division. An unattainable king. Roderick, annoyed, asked Jade how he could be weaker than his king, and the commander promised to try harder. The king wanted to start another round, but suddenly he felt something indescribable inside him. He threw the sword aside and started running because, for some reason, he felt that she was there. The image of Haley immediately appeared in his head. But if he goes in that direction, he'll find the garden by the lake. They say that Haley Duncan tried to drown herself in the river. So Roderick had a bad premonition. Since this spirit was a guardian, the protagonist decided to ask why he doesn't try to help King Roderick. The ghost of the man knelt down and asked the girl if he should reveal what sin Roderick committed. But of course, the spirit was joking because he couldn't tell her that. After all, it's a mystery of nature that the protagonist must try to discover for herself. Haley was discouraged, but her eyes widened immediately when the ghost called her by her name from her past life. She certainly hadn't said her name, so the girl wondered how much this ghost could see. Given that Kang Yije and the real Haley have each already died, once the protagonist shouldn't be so afraid. He says it as if it doesn't matter. The ghost pointed at King Roderick, thus alerting the protagonist to her husband's arrival. But he had a worried face, and once again brought a great army of evil spirits with him. Haley looked at the spirit with bewilderment, when he suddenly stood up. He informed the queen that he himself would purge the current king so that she could enjoy herself. This specter was obviously powerful, because in an instant he finished off all the evil beings rushing toward Haley. Roderick asked anxiously why she was there. Most likely this man is worried, because she is near the water. With a warm smile on her face, Haley replied that she just came out for some fresh air, and wasn't even thinking of jumping into the lake, but Roderick looked at her with suspicion. Unexpectedly, he sat down beside her, on the ground. He noticed a drawing and asked Haley if she was just fooling around by drawing in the dirt. He adopted an adorable expression, which made a smile blossom on the girl's face. Then Haley suggested to His Majesty that they go to the forest. If he had finished his training, right now is the perfect time for a walk there. Haley intrigued the king more than he imagined. The protagonist flinched when the king said calmly that she was different from what he had heard. The girl understood that she had to act more believably as Haley Duncan to avoid suspicion, but right now she was having a lot of fun being near this man. Roderick noticed a change in the girl's mood, so he asked with concern why she had gone quiet again. If she has something to say, she should continue. Instead of answering, the protagonist asked the king to get regular medical checkups to stay healthy. Roderick smiled, and standing up extended his hand for them to go to the Forest of Arthur together. Haley has a lot of fun with the king, but if she gets too involved, it could be dangerous for her. But if we keep our distance, everything will be fine. She refused, but the king threatened to carry her, so she agreed to go but by herself. The Forest of Arthur is always full of sacred energy. If that man comes here, his aura will be strengthened no matter how much she tries. Haley doubted she could cleanse half of his energy. She was stunned when the king suddenly lay down on her lap. After several times, he understood that he slept well this way. Ignoring the real reasons, Haley asked the king, annoyed if he saw her as a personal pillow. With a sly smile, Roderick proposed that the queen be his blanket, not his pillow. He understands that this marriage is not something that makes Haley happy, but Roderick wanted them to at least joke around as a couple, even though this relationship is far from normal and has many conflicts. The king felt comfortable. The idyllic situation was broken when Roderick mentioned that the annual hunt was next month. Last year it was difficult to cancel the event, but this year it is mandatory to hold it, unlike his wife who loves animals. The matchmaker is crazy and won't allow it. Seeing Haley's reaction, the man confirmed once again that she loves animals. The protagonist decided to ask why the hunt was canceled last year, if the king used to go. It turns out that the hunt is actually a social gathering, since it's not just the king's people who go, many outside eyes are around. Haley understood instantly. He doesn't want to show himself like that in front of people. The king immediately wondered if this girl had grasped his concerns, just from hearing the story. However, she always tries to hide something, so how could she worry so much about him? Roderick had never admitted his own madness for fear of definitively becoming a mad king, but for some reason, now he feels that he will be calmed if he tells everything precisely to her, the daughter of a political enemy who could run to her father and tell him everything the moment he showed weakness. Even knowing all those threats, Roderick wanted to tell her everything about himself, and only to her. However, the protagonist covered his mouth with her hand, and in a sad voice replied that it wasn't like that at all. In reality, none of that is true. He isn't crazy or broken. The protagonist was absolutely sure of it. A man with such clear and pure eyes simply cannot be like that. A few days later, there was another meeting where they again discussed the hunting competition. Duke Duncan decided to ask the king if he was feeling unwell. Like the most loyal dog, Roderick still didn't understand how such a beautiful daughter could be born from such a disgusting man. He didn't understand why he had to see his wife's face in that scoundrel. raising his hand. Roderick asked Jade to give him that document, as he had something for his father-in-law. It turned out to be an anonymous complaint about the discrepancy between the Duke's actual income and the taxes paid. Now the royal family could launch an investigation. To learn more about this, Roderick asked to be allowed to respond to those words again. He would like the Duke, Duncan, to stop tarnishing the Queen's reputation. The king would give his father-in-law only one chance to amend everything before the official inspection. Furthermore, Roderick added that next month's hunting tournament would be held as planned. He left and Duke Duncan struggled with all his might to contain his anger at the failure. In the darkness of the night, the protagonist was in her room carving another amulet for His Majesty. As soon as she finished, Roderick, who had been lying on her bed the whole time, suggested that the girl lie down with him. After Arthur's last visit to the forest, the king sleeps in Haley's room whenever he gets the chance. As if that weren't enough, it's the cleanest room in the entire castle. Without waiting for a response, Roderick got up from the bed and walked towards the protagonist. She was stunned when he, without much effort, lifted her into his arms, and then sat her on the bed, telling her that he would sleep on the sofa if she felt uncomfortable with him. But how could she make him sleep on the sofa when he had just found a comfortable place? So the girl allowed him to sleep in the bed. The king seemed to be waiting for that and instantly lay down beside her. He confessed that he was truly happy, that his wife wasn't heartless and didn't make him sleep on the sofa. Suddenly, Roderick leaned over her and asked Haley if she knew what they would have to do when they slept in the same bed. With a sly smile on his face, the man proposed doing it right now. Haley blushed deeply, and her heart began to pound. Roderick noticed that Haley had frozen at his proposal, unable to do or say anything. So he lay back down beside her, saying it was just a joke, and that she shouldn't have any trouble refusing. In reality, Haley would like to do it too, but for some reason she can't say so, and to think she's an expert on ghosts. Roderick understood perfectly that she needed to prepare herself mentally because there was someone whom Haley loved so much she would go through fire and water for him, and he would be at the competition. We are talking about Sir Lawrence. The next day, the king read the report on his wife's beloved, whose name he had already heard. And indeed, Lawrence is a knight with an exceptional reputation in the kingdom. Before his marriage to Haley, this hadn't worried the king at all. On the table, there was also the report from the pre-marriage investigation on Haley. So Roderick decided to reread it. But upon reviewing the report on the queen again, he came to the conclusion that it made no sense from beginning to end. So he began to rant at Jade for doing his job so irresponsibly. The king ordered everything to be reviewed again, and for the report to be delivered before the hunt was over. Roderick didn't understand why it bothered him so much, and concluded it was because of his suspicions about Haley. Now the girl was wandering near the lake without escorts, which is why the king ordered Jade to keep a close watch on the queen. A few days later, the protagonist was determined to carry out an important matter. The spirit behind her suddenly asked what she was looking at so intently, making the girl shudder. In reality, she had been looking for him to ask him to watch over the king during the hunt, and help him if need be. However, the ghost could not agree to such a request, as it is ridiculous for a human to try to make a deal with a spirit. If this castle were full of evil creatures, they would have already pounced on the protagonist, ruining her life. Haley agreed, but knew she couldn't handle this alone. She tried to embroider a handkerchief instead of the amulet, but it was useless. It didn't ward off the spirits. There was no remedy. It didn't have enough power. So she would have to make several. Pouring her entire soul and a ton of good wishes into them, the protagonist didn't sleep for nights and prayed constantly to give them some power to the amulets. Suddenly, before leaving, the spirit asked the girl to simply enjoy life and live in the moment. In the end, he wasn't going to help. There was barely any time left for the hunting competition. So now the girl had to continue making handkerchiefs. As she stood up, Haley's head began to spin. In the last few days, she had exhausted so much energy that she now had almost no strength left. The problem was that the protagonist had told Deborah not to follow her, so now she was alone in this place. Her strength completely abandoned the girl, and she lost consciousness. The king exclaimed indignantly that this could be interpreted as a protest against him. The protagonist tried to explain once more that she had no such intentions at all. Jade found Haley unconscious and brought her to this room. Roderick asked with disgust how many times this had happened since she arrived at the palace. Haley laughed, although in reality one would only have to count how many times the king went mad to get the correct answer. Beginning to ruffle the girl's hair, the man asked if she couldn't simply say that she was in pain. He understood perfectly that she hated this marriage, but Haley immediately replied that it wasn't so, since in reality, she had simply decided to resign herself and accept her fate. But the king wasn't sure about those words, so he asked Haley to say his name. The protagonist felt uncomfortable, but still answered that his name was Roderick Ferris Blake. She knows everything perfectly, and for some reason she has never called him by his name. Haley's eyes widened in amazement. As soon as the king allowed her to call him Roderick or Rod, the protagonist thanked him for such an honor but refused it, saying that she would continue to call him by his title. Roderick didn't understand what was wrong with her, and the girl hiding under the blanket explained that they should maintain more distance. He immediately asked if it was a secret technique of the Duncans to hurt someone with a single word, and Haley laughed. The king definitely liked this girl. every time she tries to keep her distance. The king would get irritated, but when she laughed, his mood would improve, immediately calming him down. Haley decided to ask His Majesty if it was true that he would go to the hunting competition. He was a little surprised that the girl was still worried about it, because of her love for animals apparently. But Roderick never expected the queen to offer to break even one of his hands to cancel everything. Or at least a leg, which caused the man to burst out laughing. With such thin wrists, Haley couldn't break even a finger. The protagonist realized that in the end, there was no other way than with the handkerchiefs. Upon hearing those words, the king immediately asked if she would really give him a handkerchief at the next hunting competition. Haley asked, surprised, if he had taken her words for a lie. But the girl didn't understand why the king would want to receive a handkerchief from her if it was useless. Roderick ruffled her hair again, saying that she was simply trying to say she didn't want to give him the handkerchief. He informed the girl that this conversation had wounded his soul. The protagonist promised to give the handkerchief, so His Majesty shouldn't doubt her. Roderick wondered if he shouldn't doubt that she would give the handkerchief, or that she was hiding something. Haley jumped out of bed and exclaimed that it wasn't a lie. She pointed to a pile of handkerchiefs. In reality, Roderick thought she was just protecting her feelings. But it seems she decided to give them all to someone else. The man guessed that the queen's health had suffered because she was making them. If you look closely, Haley's hands are also full of scratches. When she keeps her distance, it starts to get very annoying. But when she laughs, Roderick's soul warms up too. He doesn't like Haley risking her health for some simple handkerchiefs, but he's glad she wants to keep her promise. The man leaned over her again and asked her to rest. Because she was very pale with a serious tone, he offered his arm as a pillow. The protagonist had never rested on an arm before, so she hesitated, wondering if it was right to do so. Roderick asked her to come closer, because if she rested on his wrist, the blood wouldn't circulate well. Although she was very embarrassed, the girl moved closer anyway. To the king, all of this was strange, because sometimes the girl seemed lonely and sad. Perhaps it was because her father Duncan raised her with beatings. He didn't understand how someone could hit such a small creature. Haley froze. As the man mentioned they had a problem, Roderick didn't understand why she always looked at the lake with such a somber expression, as if she wanted to die. The confused protagonist asked why he was so interested in that. The king held her close, reminding her that she was his wife and shouldn't ask obvious questions. Even if Haley had to pay a very high price for this warmth, she didn't want to stop, not even for a little bit. So the problem was His Majesty, who took away the heroine's option to pretend she didn't notice anything. Since Haley didn't answer, the man asked her to go to sleep quickly. That was enough. She was grateful that he didn't ask anything else. Finally, a little peace. Time flew by and the day of the great hunting competition arrived. The maiden adorned Her Majesty, assuring her that the king would be victorious upon seeing her like this, but Haley wished he would place last and not kill anyone, not even a single animal. She took 3 embroidered handkerchiefs, the best ones, to give it to His Majesty. Roderick assumed that Haley had finished getting ready. In the crowd, the king quickly located Lawrence, Haley's beloved, who was looking all around as if searching for someone. Then the king also spotted Haley. Roderick smiled, guessing it must be difficult for her to live in this world being so small. The protagonist held out 3 handkerchiefs to him and explained that it would be best to carry them with him during the competition. The king accepted this gift, and Haley found it adorable how he clutched them in his large hands. Somewhat embarrassed, Roderick asked the girl what he should hunt for her. Haley began to protest, but the king explained that no fool goes hunting and returns empty-handed. At that moment, Lawrence saw Haley and ran towards her. The king came to the conclusion that his wife simply didn't want him to win the competition. It is essentially a competition. Haley wanted to ask her husband to be gentler and not to have his pride wounded, but she would remain silent because Roderick was now on the throne, so the only thing the young woman could say was for him not to get hurt and to return safe and sound. Hearing a noise behind him, the king turned sharply. In the crowd, he saw Lawrence, who was trying to approach them. Just by looking at the real Haley's beloved, the protagonist began to cry without realizing it. Memories instantly began to flash through her mind. The protagonist begged for it to end. The queen was crying while looking at her former love, which could put King Roderick in a bad position. The man instantly jumped off his horse and immediately hugged Haley, asking with concern if she was all right. The tears wouldn't stop, so the protagonist began to apologize to the king for her mistake, but Roderick didn't understand why she was crying and apologizing, as if she'd committed a terrible sin. Haley smiled when the man replied that she was very clever, because she hid quickly, and few people saw her tears. People began to think that Her Majesty had cried, because she wouldn't be able to see the king for several days. Roderick asked Haley to lift her head as if nothing had happened. He proposed, creating a bigger topic of conversation among the crowd that would overshadow this incident. The king's lips began to move slowly towards the girl's lips. All of this was the responsibility of Roderick and Duke Duncan, and the king was willing to admit it. He asked with a smile if he could count on her cooperation, knowing it was just an excuse. The protagonist closed her eyes. In that instant, their lips met in a soft kiss. That moment lasted for a few seconds. As Roderick reluctantly pulled away, he admitted that it was really just an excuse, simply because he wanted to. Now he had to leave, so the king asked the young woman to go back and be careful. All this time Lawrence had been watching our heroes. Although His Majesty said everything was fine, he had actually done it to protect her. The protagonist felt grateful, so she decided to catch up to him. As soon as Roderick stopped, the girl handed him her bracelet. The man smiled and asked if she was once again giving him what she cherished so much, leaving herself with nothing. However, Haley replied that His Majesty should return the jewelry right after he came back. For now, the heroine could do nothing more. Roderick laughed softly and thanked his wife for lending him something so valuable to her. His gaze returned to Haley's beautiful lips, and a strong desire to kiss the girl once more arose within him, but the man managed to suppress it and headed towards his knights. Watching the man walk away, the protagonist began to pray to the gods for his safe return. As night fell, they decided to make a stop. Roderick, looking at Lawrence, asked Jade with disgust if he should just shoot that guy. Duke Duncan probably planned to make his daughter a queen from the moment she was born. That's why she couldn't dream of another man. The report said that Lawrence had broken up with Haley first, and for some reason that terribly infuriated the current king. Jade guessed that it happened because he felt the burden when rumors about a state marriage began to circulate. They couldn't continue a secret relationship, so Lawrence decided to end it all at the right moment. The king remembered Haley's expression, which seemed to indicate that it wasn't over for her yet. Roderick decided to ask Jade to hunt for him. Now he must catch more animals than Albert Duncan, so that the Duke will stop talking about his son. And above all, Jade must catch more animals than Lawrence, the best swordsman in Cayenne. Looking at the sky, the king wondered what she was doing now. At dawn the next day, the protagonist decided to show respect for King Roderick. She mentally recited the necessary words. It all went much more easily than the previous time, and the protagonist was sure that her grandmother would be proud. Once the meditation was finished, the next thing was to get rid of this sheet of paper. On it was a 5-point list of important tasks that worried her greatly. It was the 5th day of the hunting competition. Jade was doing his best while the King of Cayenne simply lay under a tree. However, all this time Roderick was carefully studying the queen's treasures and noticed that the patterns on the bracelet and the handkerchief were very similar. He turned as soon as one of the knights informed him that a small chipmunk had fallen into his trap. This animal's fur is popular these days for decorating cloaks, so it could be added to their haul. But this was no ordinary chipmunk. Roderick couldn't tell if it was asking him to come closer or telling him to stay away. Is it sad or is it okay? Jade looked at His Majesty with disgust as soon as he was ordered to prepare a cage for the chipmunk. It was decided to take that little pea to the queen. Roderick already wanted to see the smile on Haley's face and reminded himself that only 2 days remained. From the diary, the protagonist discovered that Lawrence had advised the real Haley not to run away, but to form other relationships. He said he would become the queen's knight, and that way they could always be together. But the duke's daughter knew that wouldn't work. Now, if Haley's soul had not yet left this place, the protagonist wanted to comfort her and help her find peace. So as the 6th point on her list, she wrote to visit the arm where Haley threw herself. Continuing to read the diary, the girl discovered that her father was going to do something terrible, and Haley wanted to stop him. However, she didn't want to be slapped again. Judging by the diary, there were traces of Haley's attempts to understand the Duke, as she was a kind-hearted girl. Neither of the two protagonists was lucky with their parents. From the last page of the diary, one can deduce that she stopped writing 1 month before her recent death. The protagonist vividly remembered Haley's childhood. Now that she thought about it, she remembered many things from her childhood, but memories from recent years were very blurry. The king praised his captain for crushing that fool Duncan and that conceited peacock Lawrence. In the end, His Majesty did not suffer a single attack. Suddenly, the striped squirrel in the cage began to screech very loudly. The king turned sharply, ordered all the soldiers to scatter, and furiously threw his sword. It turned out a venomous snake had been approaching all this time, but Roderick managed to save his subordinates. Its bite is so venomous it can kill even a horse. The king congratulated the little one for giving the signal. Now they can set off again because Haley is already waiting. The men will soon arrive at the entrance to the forest as the closing ceremony will be held at night. They will let the horses rest. Roderick's eyes went wide when he saw a familiar person. Right at the forest's exit, his horse instantly shot off towards her, the protagonist. With a wide smile on her face, she greeted His Majesty. Roderick instantly took Haley in his arms and started spinning her around joyfully. While she congratulated him on his return, the girl was immensely happy that he had returned in his right mind and that all her efforts had not been in vain. A little later, Roderick handed Haley a striped squirrel. She didn't understand why he would bring a creature that lived peacefully in the wild. This little creature was doomed to die. But it found a noble man who saved its life. The little one immediately jumped to the protagonist. It bit everyone else, but with Haley it was gentle. Surely the protagonist's aura calmed it down. Roderick returned the girl's bracelet to her, noticing the happy smile on Haley's face. The king joked that she was happier about the piece of jewelry than about him. Suddenly, right in front of her, the protagonist saw an evil snake spirit. Haley was completely paralyzed with fear, and with a trembling voice, she asked His Majesty if he had killed a snake during the competition, and he confirmed that he had. Taking a deep breath, Haley replied that he shouldn't have killed it. It turns out that snakes hold deep grudges and, unlike other spirits, remember who killed them. But the bigger problem is that the protagonist is terrified of them. Haley covered her face with her hands to avoid seeing the spirit and pitifully asked the king why he couldn't have just walked, although she mentally understood it was an unavoidable situation, so she just had to gather her courage. However, the girl couldn't overcome it, and cursing her luck, she ran away from the king's side at full speed. Roderick, in shock, didn't even understand if she was referring to him or the snake. The hunting competition ended, and as expected, Jade claimed victory, glorifying King Roderick. The striped squirrel that Roderick brought settled by the shores of the castle lake. It seemed peaceful days were ahead, but the protagonist's worries intensified each day. Haley couldn't leave her room for fear of encountering that disgusting thing, and because of that, she hadn't seen the king for 4 days. Suddenly, Jade knocked on the queen's door and asked for permission to enter. The protagonist froze. The instant the door to the room opened, Roderick's eyes shot open, not understanding why he was lying down, when he was sure he had been sitting and working in his office. He looked at Haley in surprise when he realized he was lying in her lap. We go back in time 4 days to just after the hunting competition ended. Roderick was sure that the queen hated him, because a wound to the soul takes a long time to heal. Instead of dwelling on his pessimism, Jade suggested he go see her highness and clear things up. To be honest, Roderick didn't know how to act after seeing her cry so sadly over another man. As he had said before, the responsibility for this marriage rested entirely on him and Duke Duncan. Therefore, the man didn't want to force her. But as the days went by, the king's mental state worsened. He hadn't slept at all during this time, and now he was at his limit. Roderick began to hear voices in his head again, whispering for him to kill someone. Jade didn't know why, but he could see that the king calmed down a great deal around Her Majesty, yet he remained stubborn. Suddenly, Roxanne slammed her head against the table and shouted curses. Perhaps His Majesty was persisting like this because of what had happened between the Queen and Sir Lawrence, but Jade couldn't keep watching this, and that is how the king ended up in the protagonist's room. Roderick realized that the air was different there, and the cursed voices in his head had disappeared. He annoyedly reminded the girl that he couldn't sleep without her. The protagonist confessed she had wanted to see him too and was a bit worried about it. Like a pouting child, Roderick begged her to visit him from time to time. Roderick's bedroom was the primary concern, so the protagonist had to get there no matter what. Surprisingly, the king felt a lightness in his body. Many believe arcane magic is a myth, but it is recorded in the royal archives. Roderick asked if she had studied medicine, and Haley replied with a smile that she had not. The hero confessed that his mind cleared when he was near her. Although the protagonist wanted to tell him everything, fear paralyzed her. She was afraid of being treated differently, so she simply begged His Majesty to use her for his own purposes. Roderick held onto the girl's hand and suggested they kiss again. He did not at all expect Haley to kiss him right on the cheek. The king shot up and with a hint of indignation, asked if she thought he was a fox. The man pulled her to him and proposed they try one more time, because he wanted to check something. The moment Haley cried, Roderick felt an insane urge to kiss her. Therefore, he was going to make sure of something. The king truly couldn't deny this urge, so he laid the girl down on the bed, and she embraced him affectionately. Roderick purposefully intertwined their fingers so his hands wouldn't start to wander without control, regardless of his will. This kiss was different from the previous one because for some reason, the protagonist sensed desperation in it. In any case, it was far too direct. As soon as he was short of breath, the king pulled away slightly. He was able to confirm his theory that girl had become special to him. He couldn't even comprehend when his heart had grown so much so unexpectedly. The man decided to ask Haley if she loved Lawrence very much. Just from hearing the name, the protagonist's soul grew sad. So it seems it still hurts the real Haley to hear that name, the girl replied to the king. Roderick decided not to rush things so that Haley could sort everything out and forget Lawrence. Instead, he offered the heroine his arm as a pillow. The king said this as an excuse for her to get closer, so they could cuddle together. Haley understood perfectly that King Roderick was trying to close the distance between them. But the closer people get to her, the worse they begin to treat her. And if that person comes to hate her, she definitely won't be able to bear it. But there's no point talking about it because it's not Roderick's fault. He simply shouldn't treat her so well. The king hugged the young woman tighter, realizing that she had now settled into his heart for a long time to come. In this position, our heroes fell asleep, and in the middle of the night, the heroine woke up, because for some reason she sensed an unpleasant energy. She shuddered as soon as she saw a spirit, an evil one outside the window. The protagonist jumped out of bed, immediately to deal with it as soon as possible. It was the ghost of a drunkard begging for alcohol even though Haley had kindly asked it to leave. Therefore, the young woman coldly ordered it to stop spouting nonsense. She was ready to give that one last warning or she would simply destroy it if it came near that person again. In the end, the spirit left and an exhausted Haley fell to her knees. To solve the root problem, one must either achieve enlightenment or destroy them. But fighting a ghost is too much. However, Haley wanted to give that person a peaceful night's sleep, which is what everyone deserves. She had to try to fight at least once, so the protagonist ran to the painting and started ripping off all the amulets stuck underneath. The little spirit immediately began to protest, since if the barrier was broken, the evil spirits would come in again. But she couldn't just run away like this. So now Haley was determined to face them. As soon as the protection was removed, an evil snake spirit appeared in the doorway. It was much larger than the protagonist expected. The little spirit knew at once that Haley would not be able to handle that creature, so it decided to help. The protagonist was astonished when the little one pounced on the head of the huge evil snake. However, she immediately sensed the ghost's power weakening, so she decided not to waste time. Haley quickly performed the purification ritual, demanding that the creature forget the sorrows of this world and return home. Thanks to her little friend's help, Haley succeeded, but she decided that never again in her life would she deal with snake spirits. She collapsed onto the bed, offering for the little spirit to sleep. The next morning came, and the king finally awoke after a good rest. However, he noticed that Haley was pale and asked if she'd had a nightmare. Come to think of it, the girl had slept on the other side of the bed last night, so Roderick... He began to think he had turned her over in his dreams, wishing this were all just a dream. The man immediately asked Haley if she didn't like kissing him, but instead of answering, the girl insisted that he please never kill snakes again. After all, they have Jade whom they can ask to solve anything for some reason. The commander of the first squadron felt he was being given another heavy task. Roderick understood the girl's request, and the protagonist thanked him for listening. When the fourth king ruled, he sent a letter to future rulers so that they would be careful with the secret powers of the three houses. In another meeting, Duke Duncan once again begged His Majesty to reinstate his son on the western border. Roderick let out a chuckle and asked, "Seriously, are you talking about the one who couldn't even catch half of the animals in the competition?" Then the Duke decided to inform the king that he had already tried to discuss this matter with the Queen several times and she always refuses. But Roderick warned Haley's father not to go around gossiping about the Queen. He didn't force her to forbid anything, so he shouldn't complain publicly. As soon as the meeting ended, Roderick wondered how a father could know his daughter so little. Unexpectedly, his gaze fell on Haley. Unlike her relatives, this girl was very different from all the Duncans. The protagonist was very happy to see the king who was about to come down to her at that moment. Roderick was curious to know what the Queen was carving this time. The protagonist told him they would be those things she had given him the last time. The man remembered that those strange statuettes he had recently received had already deteriorated quite a bit, even though they were new. Therefore, he decided to buy Haley better quality wood, so she could play as much as she wanted. Roderick mentioned he got stressed at the meeting and came to clear his head. The protagonist immediately understood that her father had caused some trouble again. The king deduced that he didn't like the Duncan family and wondered why the Duke suddenly wanted to see her so much. Haley said she planned to meet with the Duke and do whatever His Majesty wished. When he asked her why, the girl replied that the king could use her for whatever he wanted, which infuriated the man. Roderick asked coldly if he had been so cold to her that she would use those words. It seems he doesn't like the word use. The girl's face darkened at the thought that the king had grown completely tired of her. Seeing this, the man took a deep breath. He thought that when she fell silent, everything became even more difficult for him. The king proposed they stop this little dispute because he regrets everything. Then he touched her gently, and then he pulled her to him and kissed her. Haley slightly parted her lips, and the king immediately licked her lower lip with his tongue. Lately, it has become very important to him what not only the girl feels, but also her soul. That's why with a childish pout, he asked if she was okay. The embarrassed protagonist replied that she was fine and that she had liked everything. Roderick apologized because he was the first to bring up the Duke. However, he then unexpectedly asked his dear wife if she would kiss him several times a day. Since she likes it, could she do it at least once? Haley decided to play deaf as if nothing had happened. In those moments, she seems so naive, although the coldness in her heart persists. The more Jade investigated, the more questions he had about the case. Now he has no other choice but to ask that individual for cooperation. By order of the commander, Lawrence arrived at his office to answer questions about the Queen. Soon the king learned that Lawrence Irwin had also reviewed the report on the Queen. The commander of the 1st Night Squadron explained that they needed it to carry out the order. The report now reveals many details, and after exhaustive reviews, the investigation was expanded. However, the content doesn't differ much from the previous one. Everyone around Haley, even childhood friends with whom she lost contact, gave the same testimony about her. Even Sir Lawrence was puzzled by his suspicions about the report, but Roderick was still upset that Haley's beloved was involved in the report. He saw that the girl asked for a new dress, at least once a week, and hummed songs non-stop. The king asked Jade if he really believed this was about his queen. At that very moment, the protagonist was sitting by the lake. A spirit emerged from the water with a cunning smile and asked if she was expecting him today. Haley, without a word, pointed to the people behind her. Although she asked to be left alone after she fainted last time, the king doesn't allow it. The protagonist decided to ask the spirit if he really wasn't going to help, because she didn't think she could do it alone, and she would most likely die first. The spirit suggested she stop doing something, but Haley refused, and the spirit noticed that her opinion of the king had improved. So far, she has done well, so she can keep trying even harder. The protagonist wanted to answer, but the man disappeared quickly. Suddenly, Roderick appeared by her side and asked if she had decided to show him her protest. If the girl wants him to fill this lake with earth, she can keep coming here. But in reality, he was worried because he thought she had returned to the lake, but it seems everything is fine. It would be great if he could openly ask the questions that interest him, but then Haley would move even further away from him, and that's what the king wants least. The man sat next to her and asked her to sing, but Haley immediately refused, claiming she didn't know how. Roderick planned to take out his fury on Jade next time for that stupid report. Then he touched Haley's cheek and suggested they kiss, but this time, she had to take the initiative. The protagonist did not resist, and approached His Majesty first. Afterwards, she slowly pulled away with a radiant smile. The king proposed they have dinner together that night, and she obviously accepted. She failed again with her unsettling list, however. She decided to try again, and asked the king if she could go to his bedchamber that night. The man blushed intensely upon hearing those words, just in case the king decided to ask a question guessing her thoughts. The protagonist flatly denied everything. Accepting that answer, Roderick told her she didn't need permission. If the spirit didn't help her, she had no other choice. Her first step would be the royal bedchamber. As night fell, she headed towards it, though, with great determination. A terrifying aura permeated the place, and she really didn't want to go in, but she couldn't give up. She had come prepared with all kinds of amulets. Roderick was surprised to see the young girl inspecting his room. He lifted her into his arms and asked if she would visit him more often in exchange for gifts. And then, Roderick laid her on the bed, begging her to make time for her husband. The protagonist blushed and quickly moved away from the monarch. On the small table next to the bed, she saw 2 amulets she had once given him. Time had clearly taken its toll on them, making them turn black. Those statuettes were now proof that the king's night had been hard. The protagonist promised to make new ones soon, and to discard these as they would break. Haley decided to ask His Majesty if he had ever committed a great sin. This situation is inexplicable unless there is a sin that deserves such a punishment. The man replied that among those who ascended to the throne they would hesitate to deny it. The protagonist confessed that she isn't such a good person either. These words made Roderick laugh as he couldn't believe it. Haley said that she was once very offended by someone, and blamed him for everything. Maybe that person had his reasons, but the protagonist didn't care to know them. One day she started to feel pity for people again, but the more she did, the lonelier she felt. There's no choice but to deal with all your internal feelings so as not to accumulate bad karma. Upon realizing this, the girl immediately apologized for talking too much, about boring things. However, just then, Roderick felt as if someone had entered his heart, although it soon disappeared without a trace. He took the statuettes in his hands and proposed giving them both names. Although only for an instant, the man managed to see the girl's true personality, and that pleased him greatly. The protagonist decided to name one of the amulets Haley, and mentally named the second one Yihai. Now even if the statuette named Haley breaks, Roderick won't be able to throw it away. He is talking about the name Haley, not Yihai. The protagonist didn't even understand what was happening because she never thought about it. Seeing the young woman's sad face, the king wondered if he had said something wrong. She keeps making a sad face, making Roderick constantly question himself. The man decided to change the subject, and asked when she would fulfill her promise. The protagonist. She burst out laughing when the king proposed a negotiation, which also brought a warm smile to Roderick's face. He pinned the protagonist's hands and raised them above her head. Haley began to doubt that it was a joke, so she kicked her husband. The king sat nearby and confessed that today he would surely be able to fall asleep instantly, even in this room. The warmth running through his body and soul was a sufficient reward for what he would do today. As soon as the man fell asleep, the protagonist cast a spell on him. She could not under any circumstances allow him to awaken during the process. Then the girl went to the center of the hall and proposed that a line be formed to vent deep grudges, but there were no volunteers because the evil spirits detect weaknesses instantly. It was better not to mess with them. She had to hide her fear and show an unwavering strength. Suddenly, the protagonist remembered the amulets that were on the small table. She ran to them and grabbed them instantly. In her mind, her husband's voice echoed, saying he didn't want to get rid of the gift with his wife's name on it. That's why the girl left a statuette in its place. Although the protagonist doubted whether she could defeat that enormous evil spirit, she decided to try. The ghost began to roar, calling the girl a harpy, but she is the guardian who protects the king every night, so she will do whatever it takes to fulfill her mission. And in the end, she succeeded. It was a good fight, but she wouldn't be able to do it twice in one night, so she will deal with the other spirits later. Now the amulet looks even more terrifying. They share names and sufferings. This brought a bitter smile to the girl's face. However, she felt a heaviness in her heart. The next day dawned. As soon as Roderick woke up, he confirmed once again that he can fall asleep anywhere if the queen is nearby. Looking at the statuette, he wondered if it was really that damaged. A few days later, King Roderick had a new hobby, sleeping in Haley's room. After spending the night in the king's room, the protagonist realized something new. He had lived in such a place without preparation or protection, which shows incredible willpower, but Haley didn't want to leave him alone in that room, and asked him every day to sleep with her. The king longed to get closer to Haley, and didn't want to break their embraces unaware of anything. But each time, the girl doubted more and more if she could afford such a luxury in their relationship. Sincerity is key, but Haley was hiding too much. One day, she went for a walk by the lake again. That strange spirit didn't reappear. And the protagonist began to think she had been too insistent. Suddenly, there was Lawrence right in front of her. The real Haley's feelings began to stir upon seeing him approach so quickly. The protagonist knew she needed to flee and fast. But her legs refused to move. The knight bowed, apologizing for his rudeness toward Her Majesty. He begged that the queen grant him at least one opportunity to speak with her. In the end, the girl agreed, and they were left alone. Lawrence only wanted to ask one question. The protagonist immediately noticed the sincerity and concern in his eyes. But those feelings were meant for the real Haley, not for her. Lawrence had heard that on the day before the queen's wedding. An accident happened that nearly killed her. He wanted to know if this happened because of him. He didn't understand why she would do something so terrible, when he had already given his promise. Lawrence wanted to be with her as her knight, but the protagonist replied that he shouldn't. The relationship between them ended a long time ago. If Lawrence doesn't give up his hopes, Haley won't be able to rest in peace either. The blonde man asked in confusion why she was crying now. Once again, the protagonist hadn't realized it. She fled, carried away by the real Haley's feelings, knowing she could never have that love. But for some reason, the girl wanted to leave such a precious person behind. As always, the king found out that the heroine had cried that day. Roderick asked annoyedly if she planned to continue deceiving him with her ex, but she said that was absurd. For some reason, this infuriated the king to the core. He didn't understand how she could love that scoundrel so much that she would shed tears so easily, just by looking at him. But it was a simple misunderstanding. Haley reminded the king he had promised not to pressure her, and Roderick replied he was only asking her not to go there. However, the king had previously said he would pay her no mind. Narrowing his eyes, Roderick asked if the situation was the same now as it was then. He asked the girl if her feelings were the same now as they were before. Faced with his serious and stern expression, the protagonist couldn't help but laugh. She apologized to Roderick and admitted she didn't want to see that guy at all. The man pinched her cheek and asked her not to make that face, because Roderick was beginning to think something bad had happened. As soon as they finished lunch, the king blurted out that he wanted to sleep in her room that night. But Haley still had to deal with a monster, so she suggested that Roderick sleep in his room while she went to hers. If they slept separately, she wouldn't have to worry about him waking up mid-process. The king, somewhat hurt, asked if she was taking revenge for his earlier words. He truly couldn't sleep without her, and every time she heard those words, the protagonist's heart would flutter. Roderick wanted to sleep together, but if she really didn't like the idea, he said they could call it a punishment for her infidelity. Haley replied with a warm smile that a punishment couldn't be so comforting. With a deep sigh, the man asked if she was doing it on purpose. The protagonist was left, stunned when he pushed her against the nearest wall. She hadn't expected at all for him to want to kiss her right in the castle hallway. However, Haley immediately responded to the kiss, which made her heart beat faster every time. Several minutes had already passed, and it was starting to seem to the protagonist that he was going to devour her. Just as she began to run out of breath, the king pulled away slightly, and then unexpectedly, he abruptly turned Haley around with her back to him and rushed her towards her bedroom door. As she had said, they would sleep separately tonight, because Roderick felt he would soon lose his mind. And then the man left in a hurry. Haley had to exercise His Majesty's room, but today everything went wrong from the very beginning. Soon everyone knew that Her Majesty the Queen was granting audiences. She almost always responded with a smile, saying she would pass all proposals on to His Majesty the King. Deborah explained to the Queen that if she didn't like something, she could simply become angry. Suddenly a man entered the throne room and said from the doorway that she had been very difficult to see lately. Duke Duncan apologized for not making an appointment in advance. The handmaiden whispered that he had arrived suddenly, saying he wanted to speak with Her Majesty. Even so, Haley wanted to meet with him at least once. The young woman's father immediately asked when she planned to bring someone from her family's house into her service. The heroine replied that she had no need to. Then the Duke demanded that the king finally restore his brother to his post, but Haley only replied that he should handle that himself. The Duke barely suppressed his growing fury and asked to speak alone. Deborah gestured that it wasn't a good idea, however. Her Majesty agreed and asked to be left alone. In the end, everyone present left the throne room. Albert, with contained rage, snapped at her. "What the hell are you doing? You're doing nothing for your family, which is collapsing at this very moment. Duke Duncan is not her father, so his anger is in vain. No one knows that the real Haley is dead, and she will not rest until she sees him angry." So the girl reminded the Duke that she never asked him to make her a queen, but in the end, he himself destroyed his own daughter's life. Albert shouted that she would regret it, because if the family falls, she won't be saved either. In a soft voice, Haley begged her father to stop doing evil, at least for now. Without a word, the Duke left the throne room. Shortly after, the king heard that his queen had shown her claws again today, revealing her temper. The protagonist recalled she had already mentioned possessing an uncontrollable anger within her. Roderick asked if she hated her father that much, and the girl replied that she preferred to ignore him, but now it was as if she were trying to hide her true feelings. Therefore, the king decided to confess that he found her very intriguing. The protagonist didn't expect such a declaration, so she immediately blushed deeply. Then the man decided to show her something, for which they had to climb the great spiral staircase of the tower. Roderick remembered that Haley was interested in King Arthur. In fact, she had even borrowed the royal genealogy to read it. Roderick the first king, believed that a divine force protected the royal family in this tower. There were the portraits of all the previous kings, so Roderick wanted to show them to Haley. In the portrait of the founding king, Cayena, the protagonist recognized the man as his spirit constantly haunted her. Haley sat down on the floor processing the information. It turned out that spirit was the king, and he unexpectedly appeared before the girl, telling her that he died at almost 40 years of age. Haley screamed in fear, and the man told her he had managed to keep his charm until the day of his death. He's still just as shameless today, but the protagonist didn't understand how he managed to look so young at 40. The former king replied mysteriously that the power to choose is the beauty of human existence. Those who drown in resentment become vengeful spirits, and those who held great ideals break the rules. Haley didn't know what her ideals were, but as a guardian spirit, he could help a little, but the dead are forbidden to interfere in the affairs of the living. The first king warned the girl that at this rate she would soon die. The protagonist exclaimed indignantly that he felt no attachment to his descendants. The ghost's appearance transformed, reminding the queen who she was speaking to. On the western border, an armed conflict had broken out. The knights managed to suppress it, and now the border is calm, the king recalled brusquely. That he had already ordered to suppress any attempt by Diamond to resurge, and now the commander had let his guard down and allowed a surprise attack. Albert, with a cunning smile, suggested that the king hold the commander of the Western Guard responsible, but Roderick urged for calm, assuring them he would react appropriately upon receiving the detailed report. Finally, the king ordered Jade to head west. However, the commander was not happy with the decision, fearing another of the king's fits of rage, but remembering the queen eased his panic slightly. During the reign of the fourth king, marriages were arranged with 3 great houses to unite the people. He was referring to the Mellon Russell and Duncan houses. The Duncan family's roots trace back to Damon, and it is precisely there in the west where their forces are resurging. And for some reason, the Duke began to talk about his son. The previous king was right to suspect a conspiracy with the Diamonds. The question was whether Duncan still wielded that much influence. They became great diamond nobles thanks to a special power that disappeared after the 5th king. Roderick immediately ordered for the queen to be brought to him, even if she was unwilling. The man could not entrust the West to Albert Duncan. The protagonist brought the gift she had mentioned earlier with her. Although Roderick reminded himself not to trust the Duncans, he couldn't resist the beautiful young woman's charm. Her creation made him burst out laughing, and he asked her to keep filling this world with such strange creatures. Then the king suggested they go to sleep. However, everything went terribly wrong from the start. Roderick pushed Haley onto the bed, and their lips met in a fiery, insatiable kiss. Reacting quickly, the protagonist pushed the king away, because that wasn't why she had come. In truth, the girl was very embarrassed. Roderick murmured, shouldn't he be the one feeling ashamed he had asked Haley to kiss him? His gaze softened as the girl leaned in and lightly brushed her lips against his. She was rushing, but she was very earnest, which made Roderick smile smugly. Haley resentfully asked if he was laughing at her, which amused the king even more. Then the protagonist hid under the covers, and in a hurt voice she announced that she was going to sleep now. Roderick ruffled her hair, and trying to suppress his laughter begged her not to be angry. In the middle of the night, Roderick woke up noticing the girl was no longer beside him. Prying his eyes open, he saw her sitting on the floor in the middle of the room wearing only a nightgown. He immediately asked her what she was doing there. Turning around, the protagonist apologized to His Majesty flustered for waking him. Haley explained she was just meditating, but the man swept her up in his arms and told her to sleep a little longer until dawn. The protagonist had made a mistake because she was sure she wouldn't wake him, but the complete opposite happened. The girl only wanted to help the soul of a small child. The ghost was furious because, as before, no one could help him, so now he was going to torture everyone. Roderick didn't know how much longer he could pretend not to notice Haley's lies. There was 0 progress on the protagonist's to-do list, and yesterday she couldn't exorcise the ghost, but now her biggest worry is going to the river where Haley had thrown herself in. It must have been near the temple in the capital, but she needed permission to leave the castle, so the girl decided to go see His Majesty. As she stepped into the hallway, she ran into the king, whose face lit up at the sight of her. Roderick told her he wanted to have lunch with her, and that they could take a walk and talk for a bit first. Actually, a guest had arrived at the castle, and Roderick wanted to introduce him to his queen. The girl told him she wanted to ask for permission to leave the castle. At first he agreed, but when the protagonist mentioned the temple, his face changed completely. He indignantly asked at once if she planned to continue taking him for a fool. Of course, the king forbade Haley from going to the temple. If she were to mention the temple again, the king would be forced to block off not just that river, but all the others as well. The protagonist wanted to explain, but Roderick asked her not to lest she anger him further. At that very moment, a man appeared before them, a complete stranger to Haley. The man bore a strong resemblance to the king, so the girl wondered to herself who on earth he was. Roderick explained to the queen that it was his younger brother Edgar. The brothers were very similar to each other, but the protagonist couldn't recall if he had ever met Haley. before her death. At the table, Edgar mentioned that his brother talked about Her Majesty until he was hoarse. But in reality, Roderick complained so much because he fears someone might seduce the queen. The protagonist, somewhat embarrassed, asked the prince to keep eating, but he simply asked her to call him Edgar. Haley asked what he did, and the prince replied that he really just wandered from place to place conducting research. He even envied that freedom. The girl said she would also like to visit different places, with a look of offense. The king replied that she shouldn't look like that. If she wanted to go so much, they could go together. The king would even make time for it. But Haley wanted to go to the temple alone. That said, the protagonist reminded him she had already promised not to do anything of the sort, so she wouldn't come to any harm. Edgar interrupted their conversation, suggesting it would be better to take a walk alone for a change of pace. One shouldn't cause a scene at the dinner table, so the prince offered the lady a dish. Haley didn't even realize, when he'd had the time to decorate it so nicely. The king told the girl to eat a lot so she could finally grow up. 3 days later, the nobility's curiosity was satisfied with the appointment of Prince Edgar as commander of the Western Border Zone as the king's representative. Roderick ordered his brother to protect the kingdom from the remnants of the Diamond Empire's army. Originally, Duke Duncan had been the candidate for this post. The protagonist confessed to the king that his aura and his brother's were totally different. Roderick explained that his brother was more of a scholar than he was, and had been a bookworm since he was a child. Haley didn't understand why someone like that would be sent to the border, but she was more intrigued as to why his father had wanted to send him there, though the king wanted to ask the same question. Roderick revealed that the girl's hair color and other details indicated that her family descended from the Diamond Empire. In other words, Haley's bloodline was the king's enemy. Following that, the king began to speak about each guest at the event and the value they represented. It felt more like a masterclass, but Haley didn't understand why Roderick was telling her all of this, since the Duncans were his enemies. The reason was that the king was certain this girl would never betray him. The protagonist's heart filled with warmth and wished to always be by this wonderful person's side. The day of the prince's departure ceremony arrived. Roderick regretted how things had turned out, but he promised his brother he could return to what he loved once things got better. He wasn't sending Edgar to the west to die. It was so that if anything happened to him, his younger brother could take over the country. The protagonist's eyes flew wide open. Hearing those words, Haley didn't know what to do if the king thought something bad might happen to him. Terror gripped the young woman's body. Upon entering His Majesty's bedchamber, everything returned to normal, and the king's room was filled with evil spirits once more. The protagonist dropped to her knees. Not understanding why the talismans were useless, everything had been in vain, and Haley's body and soul were at their limit. Roderick was frightened for the young woman, and quickly suggested calling a doctor. Then he noticed the broken statuette, and was surprised. As tears streamed down her face, the king thought he had done something wrong, and immediately began to apologize. Roderick promised that even if they turned to dust, he would cherish them as long as she didn't cry, but Haley burst into even more tears. Realizing that the statue they called JJ was on the floor, despair completely overwhelmed her. Roderick immediately picked up the fragments, and confused assured her that he would cherish them too, as their appearance didn't matter. He will cherish them. It's the most natural thing. Haley stood up and the frightened king asked her if she was really okay. He begged her to tell him everything, promising he wouldn't hurt her, forcing a smile. The protagonist replied that she was just a little tired and suggested going to sleep. It was an obvious lie on her part. At a certain point, waiting for King Roderick to fall asleep became a battle. Obviously, no one would sleep after seeing such a scene, but the protagonist had to endure it almost daily, yet she couldn't manage to understand how they could treat that person like that until their strength was exhausted. The protagonist was determined to fight, until the victorious end. The Yombra statuette remains intact, and Haley will not fight empty-handed. The protagonist always wanted to go where not only her feet, but also her heart would take her. But in reality, she was always and everywhere a wanderer roaming through a desolate land. The human heart never wavers, and Haley was determined to protect the king, even while aware of all the risks. The protagonist could do nothing about it. Her heart still beats for him, and the young woman is unable to resist. One must not bow to the darkness, and the heroine has no intention of doing so. As soon as the morning sun's rays illuminated the window, the king woke up and felt Haley on top of him. His eyes opened in a panic as he turned her slightly. The young woman's face, including her hair and nightgown, were stained with crimson blood. Roderick immediately shouted to the guards to call the royal physician. To the room. The physician ruled that Her Majesty was fine, but her symptoms were beyond worldly understanding. The protagonist let out a choked sound. The king also rushed to the bed, and the girl asked confusedly in a low voice why there were so many people in the room. She had used amulets all night and driven out half of the spirits, but then she fainted. Haley was frightened upon noticing His Majesty was bleeding profusely. The man took her hand gently and explained that it was she who had been bleeding the whole time. He desperately begged the girl to tell him what the hell was wrong with her. Roderick was trembling, frightened to see his loved one bleeding beside him. Besides, Haley always tells him that he doesn't understand anything. Confused, she asked to go to her room, fearing that her words would worsen His Majesty's mood. Roderick agreed but decided to carry the girl to her room personally. As the man carried her to the room, the protagonist lost consciousness again on the way. Now only she and he remained in the room. Roderick leaned over her and begged her to tell him honestly where it hurt and why all this was happening. If he knew the truth, he could protect her somehow, but Haley didn't want to say anything as she had barely managed to give the man some peaceful nights. The king understood perfectly that revealing one's weaknesses was very hard, but if the girl did so, he could protect her and would fight by her side. The protagonist pursed her lips, not understanding how long he intended to go on like this. She hated herself so much for not being able to say everything honestly, feeling strange and disgusting because of it. Haley pushed the king away and asked desperately, why did he have to fight for her? She is strange, very different, and Roderick knows it well, but he still tries to understand her essence. Her voice broke into a shout, and the girl begged him not to try to understand her because he would be better off that way. Haley is sure that she won't be able to bear the king looking at her with that gaze too. She taught herself how to breathe just so she wouldn't die from the pain. At that distance, the protagonist simply wants him to let her do something. The man took her hands and asked in a low voice, how could she do that? Haley couldn't even imagine what her face looked like as she tried to push him away in that moment. He begged her not to say such things about herself. She is still his wife after all. Roderick desperately promised that he would protect her at all costs if she would just open up to him.